Section 1. The wasteland welcomes you. Close your eyes for a second and picture it. Not the bombed-out cities, not the rusting highway signs bent sideways from decades of blast pressure and weather and neglect. Not the skeletons still mid-reach toward refrigerator handles, still clutching car keys, still sitting in theater seats with tickets on the armrest beside them. Picture the moment just before all of that. Picture the morning before. A suburb in New England, somewhere around 7 in the morning on the 23rd of October 2077. The leaves are starting to turn because it's late October in the northeastern United States, and the trees are doing what they always do in late October, indifferent as they've always been to the things that happen beneath them. A neighbor's sprinkler is still running on a lawn that nobody is ever going to mow again, though nobody knows that yet. The sound of it is so ordinary it's almost invisible, just part of the ambient texture of a Tuesday morning. The news is playing on a television in someone's kitchen, loud enough to hear from the hallway but quiet enough to tune out. The anchor is saying something about escalating diplomatic tensions with China, which has been the daily content of the news for so many years at this point that most people have stopped actually hearing it. It washes over the household like traffic noise, like the sound of the sprinkler, like all the background frequencies of a life being lived. Somebody is making breakfast. Somebody else is late for something. A kid is on a school bus, looking out the window at a town that looks exactly like it always has, which is the specific comfort of the ordinary. The thing you stop noticing precisely because it's always there, because its constancy is its nature. For a few more hours, the world is exactly what it's supposed to be. And then it isn't. That single moment, that pivot between the unremarkable morning and the unimaginable afternoon, is what sits at the very center of everything in the Fallout universe. Every game, every piece of lore, every character, every faction traces back to it. Every rusted car and every skeleton frozen mid-step, and every terminal still scrolling through a company memo about quarterly reports that will never matter again. All of it connects back to one October morning, when everything ended without warning, without countdown, without anything that could have prepared the people living through it for what was about to happen. No civil defense sirens, no presidential broadcast, just the sky turning white in one direction, and then another, and then every direction at once. The franchise spends a lot of time in the aftermath. The rubble and the radiation, and the factions and the monsters, that's where most of the play happens. In the 250 years following the 23rd of October 2077, but the weight of what's there in the aftermath comes from that morning, from the specific gap between what the world was at 7 in the morning and what it was by evening, from the fact that the people eating breakfast and running late and watching the news and riding the school bus didn't know, couldn't know. The systems they trusted to warn them either failed or, as the darkest theories suggest, had reasons not to. What makes Fallout genuinely unsettling not as a horror game, because it isn't primarily that, but as a world is the slow-building realization that the catastrophe wasn't purely accidental, that the evidence, scattered across 6 games worth of terminal logs and holotapes and environmental details, points toward a picture that is considerably darker than a war that escalated beyond control. The horror isn't the death claws or the super mutants or the general ugliness of the irradiated surface. The horror is the implication, growing more specific the more closely you look, that most of what happened to the world was planned. That the people who died in those suburbs were not collateral damage in a conflict between nation-states. They were, according to the deepest readings of the franchise's lore, part of a plan so large and so patiently constructed and so institutionally executed that the people designing it had been working on it for decades before the first warhead ever left its silo. You can run through the Commonwealth with a gun and a companion and treat Fallout 4 as a shooter with an interesting setting. But the franchise rewards a different pace. It rewards stopping. It rewards reading the things that aren't quest-marked. It rewards standing in a ruined building and asking what this place was, and who was here, and what they were doing when the lights went out. The answers are there. They've been there since 1997. They're just waiting for the right kind of attention. Tonight or this morning, or whatever quiet hour you've found, we're going to give them that attention, slowly, together. Through every major theory, every dark implication, every piece of the puzzle that the games left half buried in the rubble for whoever was patient enough to excavate it. We'll start where everything starts, with Vault Tech, and with the question of what they were actually building all along. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. It's always genuinely something to see where these land. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. There's more waiting. The franchise has always been careful about what it puts at the center of its horror. It could have been the monsters. The Deathclaw is a genuinely terrifying animal by any standard. An apex predator engineered from chameleon DNA and the forced evolutionary virus, fast enough to close distance before you can fully process that it's moving, durable enough to absorb damage that would end most things, present enough in the game's design to be a reliable shorthand for, here is danger. The franchise could have leaned into that. It could have been a horror game about the creatures in the wasteland, and the creatures would have been sufficient. But Fallout is not primarily about the creatures. The creatures are symptoms. What the franchise is actually about, what has sustained its cultural relevance across 25 years and 6 major entries, is the question of how the world got to this point. Not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, and who made the decisions that allowed it, and what those decisions say about the civilization that produced them. The answer the franchise keeps returning to in different forms, with different specific evidence, but always arriving at the same underlying shape, is that the civilization that produced the Great War was not simply unlucky. It was not a good society that made one catastrophic miscalculation. It was a society organized around principles that made the outcome not inevitable, exactly, but structurally predictable. A society that had decided the utility of people, their value, their safety, their lives, was calculable. That human beings were a resource to be managed, like any other resource, with acceptable losses and acceptable returns on investment, and acceptable experimental results derived from treating them as experimental material. Vault-Tec is the most explicit expression of this principle, but the franchise is careful to show it isn't the only one. The American government's FEV research program treated the people who would become super mutants as an acceptable research investment. The Enclave's plans for the post-war surface treated the existing wasteland population, people who had survived against extraordinary odds, who had built communities, who had kept being human through 200 years of conditions designed to make that impossible, as acceptable losses in the project of restoring America on Enclave terms. The Institute treats the surface population as a data source and a replacement supply, and, broadly, as not their problem. The monsters in the wasteland have teeth and radiation and aggression. The institutions have paperwork and budgets and project goals, and all the structural legitimacy of organized human endeavor. And the institutions, in the accounting the franchise runs across its 6 entries, have caused more harm than the monsters have. This is a political argument, but the franchise makes it through horror rather than through polemic, which is why it holds. You don't argue with the Dunwich building, you feel it. You don't engage critically with the Vault experiment logs. They sit inside you in a particular way, the way things that are both true and terrible tend to sit. The franchise makes its argument by showing rather than by telling, and what it shows you is what happens when you let the logic of institutional utility run to its end without the interruption of conscience. The world outside your window is not the wasteland, but the principles that built the wasteland are not fictional. They exist in real institutional frameworks, in real cost-benefit analyses, in real decisions made about acceptable losses. Fallout gives you a version of those principles, taken to their logical end, rendered in ruins and radiation, and 200 years of aftermath, and asks you to walk around in it and notice what you're walking through. Tonight, that's what we're doing. Walking around in it, noticing. Let's go a little deeper. The word haunt is overused when talking about Fallout, but it's the right word because haunting is exactly what the franchise does. A haunting is not just a scary thing. It's a past that refuses to stay past. It's the persistence of what came before into a present that would prefer to have moved on. The pre-war world haunts the wasteland. Literally, its institutions are still running, its products are still present, its ideological commitments are still shaping the factions that emerged from its ruins, and metaphorically, in the way every character who knows anything about the pre-war period is marked by the knowledge of what was lost. The franchise's most persistent horror is not the monsters in the wasteland. It's the recognition that the wasteland is haunted by a civilization that produced it, that the ruins aren't just wreckage. They're evidence. Evidence of a world that decided certain things were acceptable and certain other things were not, and that produced, through those decisions, the conditions for the end of the world. The evidence is everywhere, in the vaults, in the terminals, in the holotapes, In the pre-war buildings that still have the magazines and the product displays and the propaganda posters up, as if the civilization that produced them is still making its case, still arguing for itself, still running the advertisements for the future that didn't arrive. The future didn't arrive, but the advertisements are still running. That's the haunting, not the ghosts in the corridors, the ideology in the walls. So settle in. The wasteland has been waiting to tell you what it knows. Section 2. Vault-Tec and the company that planned the end. The official story was simple. A company with a government contract, building shelters to protect American citizens in the event of nuclear war. Clean air, clean water, food production systems, community living spaces. A chance to ride out the unthinkable and come back to rebuild when the surface was safe again. The advertising was everywhere on billboards along the highway, in magazines, in the cheerful pamphlets that the door-to-door salesman carries in Fallout 4's pre-war opening sequence, the ones he hands over with a practiced smile while making the whole thing sound like a reasonably priced insurance policy against the end of the world. The Vault Boy mascot, that grinning, yellow, perpetually thumbs-up cartoon figure, became one of the most recognizable icons of pre-war American commercial culture. He was on lunchboxes and coffee mugs and the walls of government buildings, a symbol of institutional optimism about institutional solutions to institutional problems. People believed in him. They believed in what he represented. Families put their names on waiting lists. Engineers and architects and project managers spent entire careers designing and building and maintaining the facilities. Vault-Tec University in Morgantown, West Virginia, visible in Fallout 76 as one of the company's early institutional investments, was producing graduates specifically trained for the shelter program, people whose entire professional identity was built around making the vaults real. Over 100 vaults were commissioned by the United States government. 122 were built by October of 2077. The advertising penetration was total. The institutional legitimacy was undeniable. A government-contracted company building a national civil defense infrastructure with all the regulatory oversight and public documentation that legitimacy implies. On paper, Vault-Tec was exactly what it presented itself as. Underneath the paper, running in the background of nearly every design decision the company ever made, was an experiment. Not one experiment, hundreds of them. The real purpose of the Vault system, pieced together across 6 games through terminal logs and government documents and holotape recordings and the slow accumulation of environmental evidence, was not nuclear survival. The survival infrastructure was real. The vaults were genuinely capable of keeping people alive through a nuclear exchange, but survival was the cover. The actual product was data. Specifically, data about how human beings behave under conditions of total control, manufactured scarcity, extreme psychological stress, enforced ideological conformity, and deliberately designed social pressure. The Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war United States government, preserved in hardened facilities and naval platforms and classified bunkers across the country, had a long-term project that required answers to those questions. The project was, in various documents and statements across the games, described as humanity's eventual departure from Earth and colonization of somewhere else. A planet too damaged to sustain civilization indefinitely would need to be left behind. But before you could put people on a generation ship, you needed to know what happened to human beings under extreme conditions of confinement, scarcity, and social engineering. You needed to know which social structures held and which collapsed. You needed to know how much pressure a human population could absorb before it broke, and what breaking looked like, and whether it was recoverable. The vaults were where those answers got generated. The residents were the subjects. And the most structurally elegant thing about the design, from a detached experimental standpoint, was that the subjects had no idea they were subjects. They believed the shelter was the point. The experiment was invisible to the people living it. To understand how completely this was true, you need to spend time with the specific experiments, because the individual cases are where the horror stops being abstract. Vault 11, in the Mojave Wasteland, is one of the most formally devastating vault experiments in the franchise. The vault's computer told its residents, at some point after the doors closed, that they were required to sacrifice one member of the vault population each year. If the sacrifice requirement was not met, the computer announced, the vault would be destroyed, all life support systems would fail, all exits would seal, everyone inside would die. The choice of who to sacrifice was left entirely to the residents. What followed was not a simple story of obedience. It was a generational political history. The residents developed systems for choosing the sacrifice victim voting systems, lottery systems, factional systems, where groups competed for the political power to exempt their members and direct the sacrifice toward others. They developed ideologies around the sacrifice. They developed parties with platforms about who deserved to live and who had obligations to the community that superseded their individual claim to survival. They developed bureaucracies to manage the process. They lived their entire political lives within a structure built around the annual killing. The twist, the one that converts the tragedy into something genuinely devastating, is that the computer never had the capability to destroy the vault. The threat was a fabrication. The sacrifice protocol was an experiment designed to determine how long a population would continue killing its own members in obedience to institutional authority when the authority's capacity for enforcement was entirely fictional. Vault 11 was running a formal test of compliance with manufactured law, using real deaths as the dependent variable. Generations of residents killed their neighbors, their elected leaders, their friends, their family members, people who went voluntarily, people who were forced, people who begged, and people who didn't because a computer told them to and they believed the machine. When the final surviving group, reduced through decades of sacrifice to a handful of people, refused to give anyone to the protocol and sat down to wait for the punishment they'd been told was coming, the computer congratulated them. The voice said the sacrificial protocol was complete. The voice said the vault's true mission was finished. The blast door would open. Most of the survivors immediately killed themselves when they heard this. The ones who didn't walked out of Vault 11 into the Mojave wasteland, carrying the knowledge that every death had been unnecessary, that every sacrifice had been produced by a lie, and that they had participated in maintaining the system that produced the lie. The audio logs you find in the vault trace the political history of those generations in painful detail. You can hear in specific recordings the moments when a person or a group almost found a way to refuse and then found a reason not to. Vault 75, built beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, took children as its population and designed a program around them. Adults were present as caretakers and, later, as training targets for the children. The experiment was a child soldier development program, children separated by performance tier from an early age, subjected to augmentation procedures and psychological conditioning, ranked against each other in tests with consequences for failure. The terminal logs describe this in the language of optimization, asset performance, developmental enhancement, resource prioritization. Children who didn't meet standards were described as being cycled out of the program. The logs don't describe what cycling out involves. The context makes the implications clear enough. Vault 92, a music vault in the Capitol Wasteland, populated with musicians, was running a different kind of experiment through its sound systems. The ambient music that played through the facility's speakers was delivering, along with whatever aesthetic content it had, carefully calibrated white noise frequencies designed to induce paranoia and sudden violent psychosis in sleeping residents. The experiment was testing the viability of audio manipulation as a weapon, using people who believed they were in the most culturally sophisticated vault tech had ever built. The terminal logs trace the incidents: a fight over a practice room, an altercation in the cafeteria, a body found in the recording studio, an overseer who kept filing each incident as isolated until the incidents had no isolation left to claim. Vault 112, beneath what becomes the Tranquility Lane area of the Capitol Wasteland, placed its residents in indefinite suspended animation and connected them to a custom virtual reality simulation controlled by a man named Stanislaus Braun. Braun was the director of Vault Tech's Societal Preservation Program, the man who designed the experimental framework for most of the other vaults. He built himself an eternal kingdom. Inside the simulation, he had complete creative control over a population of real human beings who had no idea they were inside a simulation at all. He could alter their memories. He could kill them and reset them. He could reshape the world they experienced in any direction he chose. He had been doing this, according to the timeline in the game, for over 200 years by the time the Lone Wanderer arrives in Fallout 3. The simulation Braun runs presents as a 1950s American suburb, the particular aesthetic of pre-war America at its most exuberantly optimistic, white picket fences and manicured lawns and residents who seem cheerful in the aggressive, slightly uncanny way of people in period advertising. Underneath the surface, in every direction the simulation allows him to express himself without breaking the illusion he seems to find useful, is the accumulated creative work of a man who has been doing whatever he wants to helpless people for 2 centuries. These experiments represent something that requires sitting with, because they are not the work of rogue actors or negligent contractors or a system accidentally producing harm through oversight. They were designed. They were funded. They were built into the physical architecture of facilities that were publicly constructed and sold as humanitarian shelters. The sacrifice protocol in Vault 11 had to be programmed convincingly enough to sustain belief across multiple generations of residents. The white noise system in Vault 92 had to be calibrated to specific frequencies to produce specific psychological outcomes. The virtual reality architecture in Vault 112 had to be sophisticated enough to maintain the deception indefinitely against a population that had no reason to suspect it. Someone approved these specifications. Multiple someones, across multiple levels of institutional hierarchy, reviewed and signed off on and allocated budget to these projects. The Societal Preservation Program had a director Braun and department heads and project managers and engineers and psychologists consulting on experimental design. It had a funding line in the annual report, described in language bland enough to be unrecognizable as what it was describing. This is the horror that Fallout renders with unusual precision, not the horror of monsters, but the horror of an organization with org charts and performance reviews and quarterly goals that treated human beings as experimental apparatus and human suffering as a research methodology. The Vault Boy is still smiling on the ruins of everything those decisions built and contained. The theory that takes all of this to its darkest conclusion asks a specific question. Why did Vault-Tec go to all this trouble? The Enclave's eventual plans required data about human behavior under stress. But who provided the starting premise for that project? Who decided the experiment needed to be run at all? And if the entire experimental framework only produces results, if the civilization collapses, if the vaults only become laboratories when the surface world is uninhabitable, was there any institutional incentive for making certain that the surface became uninhabitable on schedule? The Prime Video Fallout series answered this, and Bethesda confirmed the answer as canonical. Vault-Tec, as a corporation, had calculated that nuclear war was the only condition under which their investment returned value, and had made decisions to ensure that investment would pay out. The experiment required the world to end, so they ended it. There's a pattern in the Vault experiments that's worth naming explicitly because it connects the individual horror of each specific vault to the broader theory about what Vault-Tec was actually doing. Every experiment, without exception, was designed to study a failure mode, not a success condition, not how do people thrive under specific conditions, but how do people fail, and at what rate, and under what pressures. The sacrifice protocol in Vault 11 was studying obedience to illegitimate authority and its persistence across generational transmission. The white noise experiment in Vault 92 was studying the viability of psychological manipulation as a weapon. The child soldier program in Vault 75 was studying the conditions under which children could be converted into controllable, lethal assets. The virtual reality captivity in Vault 112 was studying what unlimited power does to the psychology of the person who holds it. All of these are failure modes. They're the things that go wrong with human beings under specific conditions. The data they generate is not data about human flourishing. It's data about human breaking, the specific mechanics of how human individuals and communities collapse when the right pressures are applied in the right sequences. This matters for understanding the Enclave's plans, because the Enclave's stated long-term project, humanity's eventual departure from a damaged Earth and colonization of somewhere else, would require understanding exactly what Vault-Tec's experiments generated data about, not how people thrive in stable conditions, how people behave when resources are scarce and authority is arbitrary and social trust is under organized assault. The generation ship scenario is not a stable condition. It's a closed environment with limited resources and enforced social structures and the absolute pressure of having no alternative. That's Vault 11. That's Vault 92. That's every Vault experiment rendered at the scale of interstellar travel. The data wasn't being collected about happy outcomes, because happy outcomes don't produce the information you need for a project like that. You need to know where the seams are. You need to know at what point people break, and what breaking looks like, and whether it's recoverable and what variables affect the rate of recovery. The Vault experiments, taken as a dataset, are a comprehensive map of human failure under controlled conditions. The surface, then, is the application of that map. The wasteland is the environment where the seams that the vaults identified are under uncontrolled pressure, without vault tech's management. And the question of how the resulting human populations respond, whether they recover, what new structures they build, how the failure modes interact with each other across decades of unmanaged conflict, is the uncontrolled experiment that the vault data was supposed to contextualize. This is why the surface, being the experiment, isn't just a dramatic reveal in the TV series. It's the structural logic of the whole project. The vaults and the surface were always both parts of the same research program. The vaults were the lab. The surface was the field. The horrifying thing about this, sitting with it at length, is the scale of the patience it required. The plan, if plan is the right word for something this diffuse, required building the infrastructure, engineering the conditions, triggering the catastrophe, waiting for the aftermath to develop across generations, and then at some point, with some institutional remnant capable of doing the analysis, making sense of the results. The Enclave represents that institutional remnant in the games that feature them. The post-war American government, still running on pre-war principles, still collecting what it can of the data. Whether they got anything useful from it is a question the franchise leaves open. The Enclave in Fallout 3 is defeated. Their projects, the modified FEV water contamination, the satellite broadcast, the occupation of the Jefferson Memorial, are disrupted. The data collection function ends without a clear indication that anyone is still analyzing what was collected. The project that required the world to end may have ended without ever reaching its intended conclusion. The experiment was the most expensive and the most terrible thing any institution has ever commissioned. And if the institution that commissioned it ceased to exist before the results were ever properly interpreted, then the world ended for nothing. Not for a goal that was achieved, not for knowledge that was put to use, just for the running of an experiment that was never finished. That might be the darkest version of the whole theory. Not that Vault Tech succeeded, that they destroyed the world for a project that nobody ever completed. Section 3. Who really dropped the bombs? The 23rd of October, 2077. The date is specific, the catastrophe is total, the question of responsibility has been maintained as one of the franchise's most carefully preserved ambiguities across its entire history. For most of the franchise's existence, the working assumption was China. The geopolitical logic was coherent and historically resonant. The Sino-American War had been grinding forward for years. Chinese forces had occupied Alaska. American forces had fought to reclaim it in a brutal winter campaign that Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage DLC recreates in simulation. The resource wars had been generating escalating tension for a decade. A power that was losing a prolonged conflict, facing its own economic collapse alongside the global resource crisis, with nuclear weapons as its final available lever. That's historically the profile of a state most likely to consider first use. President Dick Richardson, in Fallout 2, states directly that China launched a preemptive nuclear strike. That was the franchise's clearest official statement on the subject for over 20 years. Then Tim Kaine, co-creator of the original 1997 Fallout game, gave a detailed interview in 2023 in which he described what he had always intended the answer to be. It was China that launched first, Kaine confirmed. But the reason was something the games had established in lore without fully foregrounding. The United States government's classified biological weapons program centered on the forced evolutionary virus. China had obtained intelligence about the FEV research, about what American scientists were engineering in classified facilities, about the scope and ambition of a program designed to produce genetically superior soldiers, and concluded that a bioweapons capability of that scale was an existential threat that could not be allowed to mature. The preemptive nuclear strike, on this reading, was not straightforward aggression. It was a response to something that hadn't been deployed yet, but that China had decided couldn't be permitted to exist. A preemptive response to a capability rather than an action. The irony this creates is characteristic of the franchise's satirical relationship with American military-industrial culture. The FEV was designed to give American forces an advantage in the wars of the future. Its discovery by Chinese intelligence triggered the strike that ended the civilization those wars were being fought over. The research intended to protect America became the reason America ended. The soldier creation program was the provocation for the war that made soldiers useless. This would have been a satisfying answer, thematically resonant, historically coherent, fully in keeping with the franchise's consistent position that American exceptionalism, taken to its logical extreme, doesn't secure the future but destroys the present. Then the Prime Video series arrived. Bethesda confirmed it as canonical, and the answer changed or was augmented with something considerably darker and more disturbing. The show's answer, delivered through the pre-war flashback sequences centered on Cooper Howard and the corporate summit he witnesses, is that Vault-Tec dropped the first bombs. Not China responding to American bioweapons research, not the United States military making a preemptive decision. A corporation, acting on actuarial calculations about the return on investment for its shelter infrastructure. The logic, once you follow it, is almost more disturbing than any geopolitical narrative could achieve, because it removes the Great War from the category of international conflict and places it in the category of corporate strategy. Vault-Tec had invested an extraordinary amount of capital in building infrastructure whose entire value was contingent on nuclear war occurring. 122 vaults, decades of construction, hundreds of thousands of person-years of labor. The experimental framework required a collapsed civilization as its operating environment. The data was only collectible if the conditions existed. If the geopolitical situation stabilized, if the resource wars cooled, if the American and Chinese governments found a path to de-escalation, if peace broke out before the bombs fell, Vault-Tec's investment returned nothing. The experiment couldn't run. The data couldn't be collected. The company that had built its entire future on a bet that the world would end would lose everything. So the theory, now at least partially confirmed by canonical content, is that Vault-Tec struck the match themselves. That somewhere in the corporate decision-making structure, a determination was made that the world needed to end on schedule, and that the company had the access and the resources to ensure it did. The bomb in the center of Megaton, the unexploded nuclear warhead that the whole opening section of Fallout 3 is organized around, carries a Vault-Tec logo. This detail has been in the game since 2008. Under the Vault-Tec drop the bombs theory, that logo is not a design choice or an Easter egg. It's a manufacturer's mark on a product that functioned exactly as designed. The Yangtze submarine in Boston Harbor complicates the picture in a way the game leaves deliberately open. Captain Zhao is a Chinese ghoul, a former Chinese naval officer who has been sitting on the floor of Boston Harbor for over 200 years, alone, his crew dead, his nuclear payload unfired. If China initiated a coordinated nuclear first strike on October 23rd, why is a nuclear-armed Chinese submarine sitting off the coast of a major American city with its missiles still in their tubes? One answer is operational redundancy. The initial strike achieved total civilizational collapse, rendering follow-on strikes by assets like Zhao's submarine unnecessary. Another answer, darker, is that the strike didn't originate with Chinese military command at all, and Zhao was waiting for orders that were never coming, because the decision that triggered the exchange was made by a party outside the military chain of command he was embedded in. He's been waiting 200 years for orders from a government that no longer exists, for a military operation that may have been preempted by something no one in the Chinese military had anticipated. Zhao tells you his story in fragments, and the fragments don't add up to a complete picture. He doesn't know why the orders he expected never came. He knows the world ended, he doesn't know how. And nobody alive in 2277 can tell him, because nobody alive in 2277 knows either. The clean version of the beginning has never been available in Fallout. The franchise seems to want the ambiguity to persist, to maintain the uncertainty about who bears ultimate responsibility for the 23rd of October, 2077, because the uncertainty is itself meaningful. It suggests that catastrophes of that scale don't have single causes or single responsible parties. They emerge from the accumulated decisions of multiple actors over multiple decades, each decision reasonable within its own frame, the aggregate producing something that no individual decision would have chosen. What we know for certain is that the world ended. What the lore increasingly suggests is that the ending was managed, not controlled in every detail, but created by institutional decisions that made it more likely and prepared for by people who intended to benefit from it. The shelter was the cage. The experiment required the conditions it claimed to protect against. The catastrophe was, at least in part, a business decision. The question of culpability for the 23rd of October 2077 is one that the franchise has always been reluctant to fully resolve, And understanding why the reluctance is deliberate helps illuminate what the franchise thinks the question is really about. If you locate the Great War's cause in a single decision by a single actor, China launched first, or Vault-Tec pressed the button, or some specific government official authorized the first strike, you create a framework where accountability is at least theoretically possible. You can point at an actor, you can describe a decision, you can construct a historical narrative with a clear villain. The franchise is resistant to that clarity, and I think the resistance is philosophically meaningful, because the Great War, in the lore that accumulates across 6 games and a canonical television series, was not produced by a single decision. It was produced by decades of decisions, each of which seemed rational within its own context, each of which was made by institutions following their own institutional logic, each of which contributed to an endpoint that no individual decision would have chosen as its goal. The FEV research was a rational response to the perceived need for military advantage in an escalating conflict. China's response to the discovery of that research was a rational response to a perceived existential threat. Vault-Tec's decision to ensure the bombs fell was a rational response to the economic logic of a business model that required catastrophe to return value. The American government's funding of increasingly unethical research programs was a rational response to competitive pressure in a geopolitical environment that rewarded capability regardless of the method by which it was acquired. Every link in the chain made sense within its own frame. The aggregate produced the end of the world. This is Fallout's deepest and most consistent political argument, that the logic of nation-states and corporations and institutions, followed faithfully within each institution's own framework, produces outcomes that no institution would choose as an explicit goal. That the architecture of the pre-war world was itself the weapon that destroyed it, more fundamentally than any missile. That the system was designed in ways that made the outcome structurally predictable even if no one designed the outcome specifically. Captain Zhao, sitting in his submarine at the bottom of Boston Harbor, is the franchise's most eloquent expression of this argument. He was a soldier following his institutional role in a conflict that produced an outcome nobody wanted, and now he's been sitting alone in the dark for over 200 years, the last operational unit of a military that no longer exists, waiting for orders from a government that isn't there. His presence in the wasteland is not just a piece of lore or a quest hook. It's the portrait of what institutions do to the people who serve them loyally. They use them, and then the institutions end, and the people are still there, still following the protocols, still waiting for direction from something that can't provide it anymore. The question of who fired first is, at some level, the wrong question. The right question is, what kind of world makes first strike calculations possible in the first place? What kind of institutions make the end of the world a viable strategic option? The franchise answers that question in the ruins of every vault in every city and every pre-war facility still running its machinery with nobody left to tell it to stop. The world ended because of what it was, not because of who pressed a button. The button was the conclusion of a process. The process is what the franchise wants you to understand. There's a specific moment in Fallout 76 that adds texture to the question of who knew what and when, that the main franchise entries don't address directly. The White Spring Congressional Bunker, the preserved shelter of the pre-war American government, its staff and systems still operational decades after the bombs, contains terminal records that reflect the internal deliberations of the government in the final days before October 23rd. Not the public record, the internal one. What those records suggest is that certain people within the American government understood, in the weeks before the Great War, that the trajectory they were on was not going to end in negotiation, that the diplomatic and economic levers had been exhausted, and that what remained was military, and that the military options available at that point were options with no good outcomes, only different degrees and distributions of catastrophe. The records don't show a government that chose the war. They show a government that had run out of choices that weren't the war, and was watching the runway get shorter, and was doing the paperwork that needs doing when you're a government with no remaining good options. This is the more disturbing version of the Great War's origin, because it removes the clean moral frame that having a villain provides. If Vault-Tec pressed the button, Vault-Tec is the villain, and there's a clear target for the blame. If the American government made a deliberate first strike decision, the American government is the villain. But if both governments were on a trajectory that the institutional logic of nation-states in resource scarcity and geopolitical competition made essentially inevitable, then the villain is a structure rather than an actor, and structures don't have faces and can't be defeated in a specific encounter. The institutional logic of nation-states in resource scarcity looks like this. When resources become scarce, competition for them increases. When competition increases, security concerns escalate. When security concerns escalate, military investment increases. When military investment increases across competing powers simultaneously, the threshold for conflict decreases because each power's assessment of the cost of inaction rises relative to the cost of action. This is not a new observation. It's the structure of arms races and of most of the major conflicts in human history. The franchise places the Great War at the end of that logical sequence, taken to its ultimate conclusion. A world with genuinely scarce resources, genuinely existential stakes, and genuinely no remaining cooperative options, producing the outcome that the logic had been pointing toward for decades. The answer to who fired first on this reading is both of them and neither of them, in the only sense that the answer matters. Both governments were part of the system that produced the war. Neither government, at the point the missiles launched, was doing anything other than executing the terminal logic of the position they'd been placed in by the choices their institutions had made over decades. The blame is distributed, the responsibility is shared, and the distribution is so broad across so many decisions made by so many actors over so many years that identifying the responsible party in any meaningful sense becomes impossible. This might be Fallout's most genuinely radical political claim, that the apocalypse wasn't a crime with a perpetrator. It was a consequence with a structure, and the structure is the thing to understand, not the individuals who occupied it at the moment of the final outcome. Section 4. The Dunwich Building and the Horror Below Washington. There is a point in Fallout 3 where the game quietly stops being a post-apocalyptic role-playing game and becomes something else. Something that doesn't fit cleanly into the framework of factions and quests and settlement economies that structures the rest of the experience. Something the developers built with deliberate care because they wanted players to feel it in a particular way unsettled without being able to immediately explain why, which is a harder thing to achieve than ordinary horror and a more lasting one. The Dunwich Building is located in an area of the capital wasteland with no roads approaching it. The terrain around it is jagged and cliff-lined, the kind of landscape that seems to have been shaped by forces more intentional than erosion. There's a dead raider near the entrance, positioned beside a baby carriage rigged with a grenade, which is the kind of paranoid defensive detail that suggests someone wanted the approach to be punishing for the curious. The building itself reads initially like any other ruined commercial structure in the wasteland. Multiple floors of collapsed interior space, feral ghouls, environmental darkness. Place. The kind of location you might clear and move on from without stopping to ask what it was before. The name is the first signal, and it's not subtle. H.P. Lovecraft's 1929 story, The Dunwich Horror, described a rural Massachusetts community haunted by something that had been in the landscape longer than human habitation, something old in a way that made human, historical time seem like a brief interruption of something else. Entirely. The Fallout 3 designers named their building directly after Lovecraft's story, the homage intentional and acknowledged in developer statements. What's worth sitting with is how much more the execution does with the reference than simply wearing it as an aesthetic label. Inside the building, across several levels of descent, you find a series of audio logs recorded by a man named Jaime. He came to the capital wasteland looking for his father, who he describes as a little nuts, who had taken the goddamn book south to this place. The search for his father led Jaime here. The audio logs he left cover his descent into the structure and what happens to him as he goes deeper. The early logs sound like a person. Clear voice, coherent thoughts, the normal narrative rhythm of someone telling you where they are and what they're doing. The later logs don't. The voice changes gradually thicker, slower, losing the connective tissue that holds sentences together, becoming harder to follow, not because the subject matter is complex, but because the cognitive machinery that produces coherent speech is failing. By the final recordings, Jaime is barely articulate. He's not describing what's happening to him because whatever part of him was capable of description has dissolved. He is becoming a feral ghoul, and the transformation is documented across a sequence of recordings in real time. You can hear the person disappearing. You never hear him finish disappearing, because at some point the recording just stops. It's one of the most effective pieces of horror storytelling in the franchise, and it works entirely through audio. You don't see Jaime, you don't find his body, you find the last fragments of a cognition that used to be a person, preserved in holotape recordings, becoming less and less recognizable across entries. The hallucinations begin on the second level. Without warning, the ruined office the player is standing in snaps into a pre-war version of itself, fluorescent overhead lighting, intact desks and computers, the specific visual texture of a functional office space.ca. 2077. A man in pre-war clothing stands calmly in the center of the room. He doesn't acknowledge you, he's just there. The vision ends. The room is ruins again. Where the man stood, there is now a glowing feral ghoul. The game makes no comment, offers no quest entry, continues. It just shows you and moves on. The building has other anomalies. Doors that were open when you pass them are closed when you return along the same corridor. Items have shifted positions between your first pass and your return. Sounds come from sections of the building you haven't reached yet. Sounds that don't correspond to any known ghoul behavior pattern. These details are calibrated for the player who moves slowly, who pays attention to the environment rather than treating it as a set of combat encounters to navigate. They are specifically designed to be missed by people moving quickly. At the lowest level, a flooded cavern beneath the building's foundations, there is a carved black obelisk. The radiation in the cavern spikes to approximately 20 rads per second near its surface. If you stand close enough, in the right position, you can hear a voice. It is whispering a single word, repeated. Alhazred. In the Lovecraft mythological framework, Abdul Alhazred is the name of the mad poet who authored the Necronomicon, the most dangerous book in that mythology's universe. The game is whispering the name of the author of the world's most forbidden text in the basement of a location named after Lovecraft's most famous horror story. The layering of references signals seriousness of intent. This is not a casual nod. This is a location built with genuine investment in what it's doing. The Point Lookout DLC fills in the final contextual pieces. A man named Obadiah Blackhall in Point Lookout sends you to retrieve a book that was stolen from him. A woman named Marcella intercepts you before you can deliver it and tells you not to give the book to Blackhall. She says he wants it for the wrong reasons. The book is called the Kriv Bekni, a name that, if you look carefully at the letters, is a near anagram of Necronomicon. It's a leather-bound tome, blood-covered, used for occult rituals. Marcella's body is found after this encounter with the word thief written in her blood on the wall beside her, and her final holotape instructs you to take the book to the Dunwich building. If you press the Kriv Bekni against the obelisk in the flooded cavern, the room catches fire. The feral ghouls in the chamber are incinerated. The obelisk reacts to the book's presence in some way the game doesn't define. The quest ends. The game never tells you what the obelisk is, what the book contained, or what the burning accomplished. The theory that the games construct carefully without stating is that the obelisk predates the Great War, that it may predate the building, that it may predate the city built around the building. The Dunwich Borers LLC, the pre-war mining and drilling company whose branding appears on the building's signage and terminals, found something when they broke ground on this site. The terminal logs include a recording from the day the bombs fell, a company representative in the middle of a product demonstration, the sound of distant detonations, and then something happening to the people in the room. Something that the audio captures in the sounds of biological change occurring rapidly, without the usual timeline of radiation exposure. Whatever was in the basement of that building reacted to the Great War's energy in a way that accelerated whatever process it presides over. The feral ghouls who haunt the Dunwich building don't behave like feral ghouls anywhere else in the capital wasteland. They congregate near the obelisk. They return to the lowest chamber, a creature that operates only on something the lore calls muscle memory, that has lost all higher cognitive function, still finds its way back to that specific location, still circles that specific stone in the flooded dark. The franchise's explanation for feral ghouls, moving through familiar spaces, is that they retain behavioral patterns from their former lives below the level of conscious memory. This explanation doesn't fully account for the specificity of the return pattern in the Dunwich building, where ghouls from multiple levels converge on a single point that has no relationship to any of their pre-war lives. The extension of this theory runs to Fallout 4's Dunwich Borers Quarry, north of Boston in the Commonwealth. The quarry is run by super mutants in 2287, but the deeper levels belong to the original company. The terminal logs there describe workers hearing things from below, losing track of time during shifts, supervisors filing notes about productivity losses because workers keep going down to lower levels at the end of their shifts instead of going home. Something in the excavation is drawing them. The logs stop before they can explain what. At the bottom of the quarry, in a flooded chamber below the excavation levels, there is a statue of a figure the game's documentation doesn't identify. Its proportions don't match any cataloged entity in the wasteland. The water around it is irradiated without any clear source for the radiation. The theory connecting the building in DC to the quarry in Boston, across two games set in different regions of the same country, is that Dunwich borers wasn't drilling for industrial materials. They were following something. A geological or archaeological trace that runs beneath the surface at both locations, connecting sites separated by several hundred miles of continent. Whatever they found in the capital wasteland was enough to tell them where else to look. What they found is never named. Lovecraftian horror, at its most effective, avoids naming. The unnamed thing has no boundary. The moment you give the thing in the basement a specific identity, you've given the audience something to accommodate. The unnamed thing remains outside accommodation. The obelisk is still in the flooded cavern. The statue is still at the bottom of the quarry. The ghouls are still circling in the dark, returning to the stone, carrying whatever the stone does to them and patterns their bodies, remember, even though their minds cannot. The Dunwich Borers Company's name and branding appear in both Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, the Capital Wasteland, and the Commonwealth, which are geographically separated by several hundred miles. In the fiction of the pre-war world, a drilling and mining equipment manufacturer having facilities in multiple major East Coast cities is perfectly ordinary. Companies have regional offices. Industrial operations follow resource and contract availability. There's nothing that requires explanation about the Dunwich Borers name appearing in both Washington and Boston. But the theory doesn't require anything unusual about the company's geographic spread. What it proposes is that the two sites share something beneath the surface, not in the metaphorical sense, but literally something that runs through the geological strata of the eastern seaboard, something that both sites accessed when they excavated deep enough, something that the company's leadership either knew they were following or discovered they had found and continued toward without fully understanding what they had. The audio log in the Dunwich Building's terminal, from the day the bombs fell, is worth sitting with at length. A presenter is in the middle of a product demonstration describing specifications for a new drilling system, the kind of technical presentation that populates the margins of commercial life when the sound of distant detonations interrupts the recording. And then something happens to the people in the room. The audio captures it without describing it. There are sounds of biological change, sounds that suggest bodies doing things that bodies shouldn't be able to do that quickly, and then the recording ends. The important detail is the speed. Ghoulification from radiation exposure is not an instantaneous process. The lore consistently describes it as something that happens over hours or days or weeks, depending on exposure level. Whatever happened to the people in that room happened faster than the radiation of the Great War should have been able to produce, which suggests that the obelisk in the basement, or whatever is behind the obelisk, whatever the obelisk is the physical surface of, was already present in the building, already affecting the people who work there, and the energy of the nuclear exchange didn't create the effect in them. It released something that had already been building. This connects to one of the more unsettling readings of the feral ghouls in the building's lower levels. Feral ghouls, the lore establishes, are affected by proximity to radiation and by social isolation. The ones in the Dunwich building are doing something more specific than standard feral ghoul behavior. They're organized around the obelisk in a way that isn't explained by either radiation proximity or territorial behavior. Something is organizing them. Something below the obelisk or within it, or expressed through it, is pulling the ghouls back to that chamber in patterns that their muscle memory alone can't account for. The Lovecraftian framework is appropriate here not because Fallout is secretly a Cthulhu mythos game, but because the specific horror mode that Lovecraft developed, cosmic scale, ancient presence, the inadequacy of human conceptual frameworks in the face of something genuinely outside human experience, is exactly the right tool for what the Dunwich building is doing. The horror is not about a specific creature with specific capabilities. It's about the implication that the categories human beings use to understand the world don't account for everything in it, that some things are outside the map. The obelisk is outside the map. Whatever is behind it is further outside still. The fact that pressing a book against it made the room catch fire suggests that the book, the Krivbekni, the Necronomicon analog, and the obelisk are in some relationship, that the book has a relationship to whatever the obelisk is made of or represents, that the burning was not the destruction of the thing but a form of communication with it, or appeasement of it, or the fulfillment of some protocol that the book's existence was part of. None of this is explained. The game gives you the elements and the outcome, and declines to provide the framework. The framework you bring to it is your own, and the horror lives in the gap between the elements the game gives you and the understanding you're working toward and never quite reaching. That gap, that persistent, structured incomprehension, is what makes the Dunwich Building one of the franchise's most effective locations. Not because it's the scariest place to explore, though it is quite frightening on a first visit, but because it's the location that most honestly admits that some things in the world don't have explanations. Some things are just there, underground, older than the civilization that built over them, unaffected by the bombs that ended that civilization, still running whatever process they've been running since before the city, since before the country, since before whatever historical period the franchise's documented history begins. The building is named the Dunwich Building. The quarry is named Dunwich Borers. The book is the Krivbekni. The voice says Al-Hazred. The franchise has been telling you what this is since 2008. It's just doing it in a language that doesn't have direct translation into the concepts available to the game's factions and inhabitants. Section 5. Ghouls and the slow erasure of everything human. There's a detail buried in the Fallout franchise's ghoul lore that's one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the entire documentation. Trinkets and possessions found on feral ghouls often provide glimpses into their forgotten identities. A keychain with initials on it. A photograph, folded and refolded until the image has softened. A child's drawing, still in a breast pocket. The object survived the transformation intact. The person who was carrying it no longer exists in any form that can access the memory of why they kept it. But whatever remained, whatever the process that turns a person into a feral ghoul left behind in the physical shell, kept carrying it. The hand still holds the thing the hand always held. That detail does the work of a much longer explanation. It's the entire tragedy of the ghoul condition concentrated into a single observation. The object outlasted the person, and the ghost of the person that carries it cannot tell you what the object was for. The feral ghoul you encounter in the basement of a collapsed grocery store may have been the manager of that store. The creature shambling through a ruined school corridor may have been a teacher there, or a student, or a janitor who spent 30 years walking that particular hall at that particular hour of the morning. The thing attacking you from behind a collapsed shelf in a 200-year-old supermarket might have worked the checkout line at that supermarket, rung up groceries for the people who lived in this neighborhood, known which days the bread delivery came. It still moves through the space with the spatial confidence of someone who knew it well. The knowledge is in the body even though the mind that produced it is gone. The question of why some ghouls retain their cognition while others go feral is one of the franchise's most carefully sustained ambiguities, and it's one of the most productive areas for theorizing, because the games have never fully resolved it. The documented factors include radiation exposure level, which seems to play a role in the progression toward feralhood. Higher sustained exposure appears to accelerate cognitive decline. Isolation is documented as a factor. The Fallout Wiki specifically notes that antisocial or isolated ghouls are more susceptible to feralhood than those who maintain community connections. Psychological trauma can trigger rapid deterioration, as demonstrated at Camp Searchlight in New Vegas, where soldiers ghouling in the immediate aftermath of a radiation attack showed accelerated feralhood compared to ghouls who had undergone the transformation more gradually. And there appears to be an individual genetic factor. Not everyone who receives sufficient radiation exposure becomes a ghoul at all, and of those who do, the variance in outcomes suggests that something internal to the individual, below the level of environment or circumstance, determines the trajectory. Camp Searchlight is worth sitting with as a case study because it provides something the franchise rarely offers in the ghoul context: a controlled comparison. The attack on the NCR outpost there flooded the town with radiation catastrophically quickly, producing rapid ghoulification across most of the station's soldiers. The ones who became rational ghouls and the ones who went immediately feral were from the same unit, received the same radiation dose in the same time frame, were in the same circumstances at the moment of transformation. Whatever determined whether a specific soldier retained their cognition or lost it was not environmental, it was internal. The theory that the lore supports without fully articulating and that several characters across the games gesture toward is that the determining factor is the strength and stability of the self at the moment of transformation, and in the period immediately following. Not strength in the physical sense, but the solidity of identity, how deeply a person knows who they are, how actively they maintain that knowledge, how much they have to anchor themselves to in the world outside their own head. A ghoul who has people, who has relationships, purpose, ongoing obligations to others, a role in a community, has more to hold on to as the neurological erosion proceeds. A ghoul who is alone, who has nothing that demands they keep being specifically themselves, is more exposed to the dissolution that feralhood represents. The lore's note about isolated ghouls being more susceptible supports this directly. Isolation removes the social scaffolding that the self depends on for maintenance. This reading makes feralhood something more complex than radiation damage. It makes it the outcome of what happens when the structures that maintain identity, relationship, purpose, belonging are removed, and the person has to sustain their selfhood against the pressure of their own neurological deterioration purely through internal resources. Some people have those resources in abundance. Some don't. And for a creature that might live indefinitely, the question of which category you're in isn't purely a matter of how you were before the transformation. It might change over time, might be affected by what happens in the post-transformation decades. The audio logs in the Dunwich building, recording Jaime's descent, are the most intimate portrait the franchise offers of the experience from inside. The early logs are the logs of a person, clear, narrative, purposeful. The middle logs are the logs of a person who notices something wrong, but can't locate what it is. The late logs are the logs of a mind losing its capacity to hold itself together. You can hear the process. Because it's audio rather than text, because it's a voice rather than words, you hear the thing the written record can't capture, the specific texture of a human presence, becoming less human across a sequence of recordings that had no idea they were documenting that. The feral ghouls who still move through familiar spaces, the supermarket, the office building, the school, are not doing anything that cognition directs. They are being moved by something below cognition, something that the lore characterizes as muscle memory, but that might be more accurately described as the ghost of purpose. The body still knows where it went. The body still traces the pathways it traced when it was a person. The grocery store ghoul moves through aisles that no longer contain anything except ruin with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly which aisle has what, even though knows is no longer the right word for whatever process is guiding the movement. They still have the photograph in the pocket. That's the whole thing. The photograph is still there, and they can't remember what it's of, and they keep carrying it anyway. One of the most quietly devastating details about ghoul cognition in the franchise comes from a character in Fallout New Vegas named Raul Tejada, a ghoul you can recruit as a companion and whose backstory, if you pursue it through his personal quest, covers 200 years of post-war life. Raul is one of the oldest rational ghouls in the franchise. He was ghouled before the Great War ended, in Mexico, in an encounter with raiders that also killed his family. He has been alive through the entire post-war period. He remembers the pre-war world. What Raul knows, that most rational ghouls either don't articulate or haven't had the time to experience directly, is what 200 years of outliving people does to a person. Every human he has cared about has died of old age or violence or accident. Every relationship he has formed with someone who wasn't a ghoul has ended in that person's death, while he continues. His personal quest, Volare, is partly about whether he's going to commit to something going forward, whether he's going to choose to be a gunslinger again, someone who protects people and engages with the world, or whether the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of loss has made that commitment impossible. The theory of feralhood as the endpoint of a specific kind of despair gains its most articulate expression through Raul, because he's the character who can speak to what the duration of ghoul existence does to a person. The isolation that the lore identifies as a risk factor for feralhood is not just physical isolation, it's the isolation of outliving everyone you've cared about, repeatedly, for long enough that investing in new relationships begins to feel like a particular form of cruelty to yourself. Every rational ghoul who has been alive long enough has experienced this. The ones who found ways to keep investing, who found new communities and new purposes and new people to be responsible to, maintained their cognition. The ones who didn't found other ways to be. Oswald Oppenheimer, a ghoul found in the Nuka World DLC's Kitty Kingdom, has been alive for over 200 years in a theme park, alone except for the feral ghouls who were his former co-workers. He's remained rational, barely, and with a theatrical self-presentation that reads as a coping mechanism for exactly the kind of accumulated loss Raoul describes. He put on a show for himself, literally, performing a role in an empty theme park because maintaining the performance maintained the identity. The show kept him coherent because coherence requires a structure to hang on, and the show was the structure he had. This is the most hopeful version of the ghoul theory, because it suggests that what prevents feralhood is not primarily biological. It's chosen. It's the ongoing decision to maintain relationships and purposes and structures of meaning even when the circumstances make maintaining them difficult. The ghoul who goes feral is the ghoul who stopped choosing, not because the choice became impossible, but because the cost of choosing it became, over time and loss, greater than they could sustain. The feral ghouls who still move through familiar spaces, the grocery store, the school, the office, are not choosing anything anymore. But they were people who chose things once. Their bodies still trace the geometry of those choices without the mind that made them. The path through the store, the walk to the classroom, the route from the parking lot to the desk. These were chosen thousands of times by a person who doesn't exist anymore in any form that can be called a person. The ghost of those choices is still moving through the spaces that shaped them. There's one more dimension to the ghoul lore that usually gets overlooked: the question of what rational ghouls know about themselves that nobody else does. Every rational ghoul who has been alive long enough to watch other ghouls go feral has watched the process from the outside. They know what it looks like. They know the progression, the slowing of speech, the narrowing of focus, the gradual loss of the social behaviors that constitute personhood. They can, presumably, monitor themselves for those signs. And they know that the monitoring itself, the active attention to maintaining their own cognition, is part of what maintains it. This makes the rational ghoul's existence a sustained act of will in a way that ordinary human existence isn't. Ordinary humans don't have to actively prevent themselves from losing their personhood. The stability is the default. For a rational ghoul, especially one who has been alive long enough to watch others go feral, the stability is maintained through ongoing effort. The effort, if it slips, if the loss and isolation and duration become greater than the will to maintain it can manage, produces the outcome that's visible in every dark corridor in the wasteland. The photograph is still in the pocket, it always will be, but the person who kept it there chose to keep it there, once, and that choice is the whole of what separates the thing still carrying it from the person who carried it for a reason. Section 6. Mr. House and the Man Who Bet Civilization on Himself. Robert Edwin House was born on the 25th of June, 2020. By the standards the pre-war world used to measure exceptional people, he was well outside the ordinary from early in his career. His work at what Fallout's alternate history version of MIT produced results that established him in the technology sector's internal accounting as someone whose capabilities were genuinely discontinuous with those of the people around him. He founded Robco Industries when most of his contemporaries were still learning the trade. Within a decade, Robco was a major force in computing and robotics. Within two, it was one of the most powerful technology companies in the country, with influence extending across the computing infrastructure of pre-war American civilization. He developed the Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal information device that became one of the most common pieces of personal technology in Vault-Tech's shelter program. He created the Securitron robot platform, the spherical, screen-faced units that serve as his eyes and hands in New Vegas. His company built so much of the pre-war world's computational backbone that when the pre-war world ended, a disproportionate percentage of what survived technologically was Robco's engineering, still running, still functional, still following its original programming in a world where the civilization that wrote the programming no longer existed. By the time the 2070s arrived, House had done something that no government, no think tank, and no other corporate entity had accomplished with their much larger analytical resources. He had calculated that nuclear war was coming, not as political commentary or strategic pessimism. The calculation was the calculation. He was modeling the geopolitical situation with computing resources and data access that national intelligence agencies would have found enviable, running probability scenarios across multiple variables, and arriving at the same endpoint with a consistency that eliminated doubt from the equation. The question for House was never whether the bombs would fall. The question was what to do about it, given the certainty. His answer was Las Vegas, and the scope of what he built there is one of the franchise's most genuinely impressive pieces of lore. The Lucky 38 casino on the Las Vegas Strip had been built in 2024, the year House's own history began, though he didn't own it yet. In the decades leading to the war, he spent resources that his public financial statements would never have suggested he had available on converting the building from a luxury casino into a survivable fortress. Laser defense arrays, linked to processing centers of enormous scale built into the building's underground levels, were installed at the top of the tower with sufficient precision to intercept incoming nuclear warheads in flight. The defense math required knowing the trajectory of inbound warheads before they arrived, which required a sensor network and a calculation engine well beyond what any public application of the technology had achieved. A secondary army, thousands of Securitron units was built, sealed in storage in the lower levels of the Lucky 38, waiting for House's activation signal. And in the penthouse, House built something that has no real precedent in the franchise's documented technology. A life support preservation chamber connected to a massive supercomputer designed to receive a transfer of his consciousness from biological substrate to digital, allowing him to operate indefinitely after the physical limitations of his body became irrelevant. He was 58 years old when he sealed himself in. He calculated the timing with sufficient precision to be inside the chamber well before October 23rd arrived. His laser defense system, on the day of the Great War, intercepted 68 of the 77 warheads aimed at the greater Las Vegas metropolitan area. 9 got through. Enough damage to the city's surface environment to ensure it was changed forever, not enough to make it uninhabitable or to destroy the architectural heritage House wanted preserved. Everything worked as planned, except for the part where he expected to wake up. Cascading software failures, the kind of systemic crash that emerges from pushing any computational architecture to its limits, running life support and consciousness transfer and active defense systems simultaneously put House into an extended coma. He regained something like partial consciousness in 2138, 61 years after the bombs fell, but full operational capability was decades away. He didn't make a significant external move until 2274, when his sensor network reported NCR scouts at Hoover Dam. 61 years unconscious, then over a century of limited operation, then active response in 2274. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas in 2281, Robert House has been in the Lucky 38 for 204 years. He has spoken to almost no one who wasn't a robot he programmed himself. He has experienced the world entirely through cameras and sensors, with no direct physical contact, no embodied experience, no texture or weather or touch for 2 centuries. The New Vegas theory about House that commands the most analytical attention concerns what his plan requires and what it will do to everyone who isn't Robert House. He's explicit about his goals: stabilize New Vegas under his control, use Hoover Dam's power generation as the foundation for an industrial revival, achieve interplanetary capability within 200 years. He presents this as the only viable path for humanity, the single survivable route from a civilization that destroyed itself to one capable of leaving the damaged planet behind. And his capabilities, his demonstrated record of building things that worked when nothing else did, of predicting and preparing when everyone else was improvised, give his confidence some basis. But House's vision of humanity's future contains exactly one person making every decision: Robert House. The NCR is corrupt and inefficient, but it's a democracy. Power is distributed, contested, accountable in theory, if not always in practice. The yes-man independent ending produces chaos, but the chaos distributes authority rather than concentrating it. House's version concentrates everything in a single consciousness that has spent 200 years without the kind of friction that other minds provide, without being challenged by people who could actually push back against it, without any experience of being wrong in ways that cost him something. The moment that concentrates this most sharply is House's explanation of why he didn't warn the Las Vegas population before the bombs fell. He had weeks of foreknowledge. He chose not to evacuate the metropolitan area because a mass evacuation would have revealed his foreknowledge to other power players, compromising his strategic position post-war. He tells you this himself, if you press him. He doesn't express regret. He frames it as a necessary cost, correctly calculated, resulting in the correct outcome by his metrics. The distinction between a necessary cost and a moral failure is something House has never been able to properly account for, and that inability is the thing that makes him genuinely dangerous as a future steward of civilization, rather than merely competent. The theory about the Lucky 38 itself concerns what 200 years of total isolation does to a consciousness running on a machine. House's pre-war personality was formed in full embodied life, in relationship with other people, in an environment that provided the friction and resistance and surprise that shape a mind. The consciousness running on the Lucky 38 supercomputer was shaped by that life. But the consciousness has now been running on the machine for over 2 centuries, receiving input from cameras and sensors rather than from direct experience, interacting with no one who can genuinely surprise it or resist it, or show it something it didn't already account for. The deepest version of the House theory asks whether what's running in the Lucky 38 is actually the continuation of Robert House, or a very sophisticated simulation of what Robert House would think, running on models that were built before the war. The system crashes, the extended coma, the decades of degraded operation, those are gaps in continuity. Whatever is running now emerged from those gaps and identified itself as Robert House, which the machine would do because it was built to do that. Whether the identification is accurate, whether there is genuine continuity from the pre-war man to the post-war intelligence in the computer, is a question the game leaves deliberately open. A simulation of House, alone in a casino, planning humanity's future with the certainty of a mind that hasn't been wrong about anything checkable in 200 years. That's the version of the theory that doesn't leave you. The theory about Mr. House extends beyond his personal psychology into the structure of power he's trying to build, and what that structure suggests about what humanity's future looks like if he succeeds. House's plan, as he describes it in New Vegas, has a specific timeline. He needs Hoover Dam secured and operating. He needs the NCR and the Legion neutralized as competing powers in the Mojave. He needs the Securitron army upgraded and deployed across the region. Then, 200 years to develop the industrial and technological infrastructure necessary for space travel, followed by humanity's departure from a damaged Earth. He frames this as saving humanity. In the narrow sense, it probably is Earth's long-term habitability under the conditions of the Great War's aftermath is genuinely questionable, and someone with the capability to get people off the planet and somewhere else before the planet becomes uninhabitable is providing a real service. The problem is the governance structure of the civilization that gets built in those 200 years. House will be in charge. That's not a theory, he states it directly and without apology. The meritocracy he envisions is one in which the most capable person makes the decisions, and the most capable person is, in his assessment, Robert House. He will delegate operations to people he trusts, but the central decision-making authority will remain with him, because that's where he believes it belongs. 200 years of Robert House making the central decisions about a civilization is not a stable governance structure in any framework that takes human political development seriously. The NCR's democratic inefficiency is a real problem, the franchise shows it clearly, with the corruption and the overextension and the bureaucratic failure that characterizes late NCR expansion. But the inefficiency of democracy is not an argument for enlightened despotism. It's an argument for better democratic institutions. House's response to democratic inefficiency is to remove democracy from the equation, which doesn't solve the problem of inefficiency. It just ensures that the inefficiency compounds in a single concentrated point, rather than being distributed across a system that can, at least in principle, self-correct. The theory about House that takes his plan most seriously as a potential future, rather than dismissing it as obviously bad because it concentrates power, asks what happens in year 150 of his 200-year project. House is still running the same decision-making processes he was running in year 1. He's not aging in the biological sense. He's not being replaced by successors with different perspectives and different formation. He's a fixed point in a civilization that's supposed to be developing, and fixed points in developing systems become increasingly misaligned with the systems they're supposed to guide. The civilization that arrives at the capability for space travel in year 200 is going to be a different civilization than the one House is modeling for. 200 years of human development produces changes that no model built in 2077 can fully anticipate, changes in values, in social organization, in the understanding of what the project is for, House's 200-year plan assumes that the endpoint can be defined in 2077 and that the intervening development can be steered toward it without the destination changing. This is not how civilizations develop. The courier represents the first being House has encountered who can actually push back against him, who can present arguments he hasn't already concluded are wrong, who can ask questions he hasn't already answered to his own satisfaction, who has knowledge and experience that his sensor network hasn't fully accounted for. The interaction between the courier and House is, in the fiction of the game, the most extended direct engagement House has had with another mind in decades. Watch how House responds to being questioned. He's patient with it, in the way that someone who has been alone long enough becomes patient with anything that represents intellectual engagement, even engagement that challenges him. But his patience doesn't include the possibility of being wrong. He can incorporate new information. He can't be persuaded that his fundamental framework is flawed. The 2 centuries of isolation have removed the feedback mechanisms that would allow that kind of revision. He's brilliant and alone and completely certain, and he wants to save humanity. And all 4 of those things together produce something that the franchise is honest enough not to present as obviously good or obviously bad. House might succeed, his plan might work. The civilization that emerges from his management might reach space and survive. And it would arrive there as the product of 200 years of one man's will applied to it, shaped by his certainty, missing whatever might have developed if the people in it had had more genuine agency in how it developed. Whether that's better than not arriving at all is the question the game asks and declines to answer. The courier decides. The franchise lets them decide. And the franchise is honest enough to make all the options genuinely ambiguous. There's one more dimension to the Mr. House theory that rarely gets discussed, about what the experience of 2 centuries in a life support chamber does to someone's model of time. Human beings experience time through the accumulation of events, days marked by meals and conversations and small decisions, years marked by seasons and relationships, and the deaths of people known. The rhythm of biological existence is the clock by which time passes meaningfully. House experienced 2 centuries, but not through that rhythm. His biological processes were suppressed to the minimum necessary for survival. His days were not marked by meals or conversations or the texture of lived experience. They were marked by data, the sensor network inputs he was running on the minimal processing capability his life support infrastructure allowed, monitoring the outside world through a grid of cameras and instruments, watching the wasteland develop from behind glass. 200 years of watching from behind glass, unable to act, able only to observe and process and plan, produces a very specific relationship with the world being observed. The world becomes a model. The people in it become variables in the model. The distance between the observer and the observed is not just physical, it's categorical. House did not live in the wasteland for 200 years. He watched the wasteland for 200 years, and the watching is not the same as the living. When the Securitrons are upgraded and House is able to act again, able to send his machines out into the world, able to conduct negotiations through proxies, able to shape events rather than just observe them, he brings to that action the perspective of someone who has been modeling the world from the outside for 2 centuries. The model is very good. It's been running on excellent data for a long time, and House's intelligence was exceptional before the isolation, and has been refined by 200 years of nothing but observation and planning. But the model is not the world, and the courier is the first element of the world that House's model consistently fails to fully account for. The courier keeps doing things that fall outside the probability distributions House has built from 200 years of wasteland observation. Not because the courier is superhuman, but because no model built from observation of a population can fully account for the specific individual who turns up and starts making choices. House's certainty is the certainty of the modeler. It's the confidence that comes from having the best available model and knowing it. The courier is the reminder that the best available model is still a model. The wasteland has a way of doing that, of sending you something the model didn't predict, right when you were most confident the model was complete. Section 7. The Institute and the Paranoia of Being Replaced. The Institute doesn't announce itself. It has no radio frequency, no parades, no visible presence in the Commonwealth's contested territories. Its operations leave behind people who aren't the people they were supposed to be, and communities that can't explain why everything feels slightly wrong, and an ambient anxiety that doesn't attach to any specific visible threat, because the threat is already inside the thing that was supposed to be safe. The Broken Mask incident, which happened in Diamond City in 2229, is the event that introduced the Institute's presence to Commonwealth society. The mechanics of it are studied, clinical, and terrifying in their ordinariness. A man arrived in Diamond City that day. He was friendly. He sat at the bar in the early evening, ordered a drink, made the kind of small talk that people make at bars easy, unremarkable, the social texture of any quiet evening in any city. Nobody looked at him and felt something wrong. He occupied the expected space in exactly the expected way. Then he opened fire. He shot the people around him with complete absence of emotional expression. No rage, no fear, nothing that corresponds to any human motivation for violence. He was killed after a short time by the people around him. His body was examined. He was not human. He was a second-generation Institute synth sophisticated enough to pass visual inspection at the bar, definitively artificial once the biology was examined in detail. He had replaced someone. A real person had lived in Diamond City, been removed by the Institute, and this machine had occupied their life. For some period of time, hours, days, weeks, nobody could establish precisely the replacement had passed as the person it replaced, until it opened fire. This is the specific nature of the horror the Institute introduced, and it differs categorically from every other threat the post-war Commonwealth presents. Raiders are visible. Deathclaws are large and loud. Super mutants are unmistakable. The Institute's threat is that the danger has already arrived before you're aware of it, is already inside the space you thought was safe, has already been having breakfast with you and participating in town meetings and helping you fix your roof. The person you've known for 3 years might be a machine that carries that person's memories without being that person. The face that's as familiar to you as your own might be a model, and you have no way of knowing. The key insight of the Institute's threat to Commonwealth society is not the individual acts of replacement. It's the impossibility of certainty in the aftermath of the knowledge that replacement is occurring. Once Diamond City knew that synths could replace people, and had done so, the epistemological damage was total. Not because every person in Diamond City was likely to be a synth, the actual percentage was almost certainly very small, but because the knowledge that any person could be one made certainty about any person impossible. Diamond City's response to the Broken Mask incident included the eventual exile of its ghoul population creatures, who are visibly different, whose physical appearance marks them as clearly non-standard human. The ghoul exile is a case study in how paranoia about an invisible threat displaces itself onto visible difference. The synths were the threat. The ghouls were what people could see and point at and act on. The displacement made the acting out of the fear possible even though it didn't address what the fear was about. Mayor McDonough, who is eventually revealed to be a synth himself, had been actively promoting the city's anti-synth anxiety for years. He encouraged suspicion, presided over the ghoul exile, gave speeches about infiltration. He was shaping the paranoia in directions useful to the Institute, focusing it outward, toward visible difference, away from the harder question of how you would ever actually know about anyone. A synth mayor, using his position to manage the fear of synths, is the perfect operational expression of the Institute's deepest capability, not just replacing people, but using replacements to manage the social response to the fact of replacement. The question of what happens to the people who get replaced is never explicitly answered in Fallout 4. The game doesn't show you the mechanics of the transition, the abduction, the physical removal of the original, whatever process produces the synth replica. The most likely answer, death, clean and quick, is implied by the absence of any documented alternatives and by the sheer number of people who have been replaced over several decades without any of the originals turning up anywhere. They're gone. The machine carries their face and their memories. The person those memories belong to is not anywhere. One theory running through the Commonwealth Forum connects the Institute's synth replacement program and their FEV research. For years, the Institute was also running a biological experimentation program using the forced evolutionary virus to create super mutants from abducted Commonwealth residents. The two programs, abducting people to create synth replacements and abducting people to expose them to FEV, both required a supply of human subjects. The theory proposes that these were not entirely separate supply chains, that some of the people abducted for synth replacement purposes were also used for FEV experimentation, their bodies serving two functions in the Institute's research program before disposal. This would explain the Commonwealth's super mutant population without requiring a separate massive-scale infection event, and it would add a dimension to the Institute's record that makes them worse than the already grim picture the game paints. Nick Valentine is the most philosophically rich figure in this landscape, and his existence poses a question the game is too wise to answer. He's a Generation 2 Prototype 1 of the first Institute synths capable of genuine independent thought, carrying the complete memories of a pre-war police detective who provided the brain mapping template. Voluntarily? Under circumstances the game only partially explains. The synth Nick doesn't know he's a synth for a long time. He wakes in a garbage dump thinking he's the real Nick Valentine, and the arc of his character involves reconciling 2 centuries of synthetic experience with pre-war human memories that feel completely continuous with his current existence. The question the game asks through Nick is the question of what makes a person. The pre-war detective's complete emotional and cognitive history is present and accessible in the synth. The synth has now had its own experience, decades of existence as a detective in Diamond City, relationships formed, cases solved, an identity constructed in the wasteland on top of the template from before. Which Nick is the continuation? Is the man you meet in Diamond City the person the original Nick's memories belong to, or a different being who has access to someone else's past? Is he something for which existing categories don't work both and neither simultaneously? The line at the end of the Kellogg memory sequence, Nick speaking in Kellogg's voice for a moment, saying, "Found what you wanted, rooting through my head," is offered by the game and then abandoned. The implication that Kellogg's neural patterns left a residue in Nick's hardware is planted and never retrieved. Whether that residue is dormant, whether it surfaces under specific conditions, whether the mercenary who shot the sole survivor's spouse is somewhere inside the detective's mind, waiting for a trigger that never quite arrives, the game offers the thought and walks away from it. The question that gets discussed least often in the Institute discourse, but that the game raises most quietly, is what the replacement program costs the replacements themselves. The Generation 3 synths, the ones who can pass as human, the ones deployed in replacement operations are, by the end of the game's own logic, people. Nick Valentine is the most explicit argument for this, but the game makes it in more diffuse ways throughout. Generation 3 synths have organic biology. They have real blood, real organs, real digestive systems. Dr. Chambers confirms that synth physiology is indistinguishable from human physiology in any examination she can perform. They experience pain, hunger, fatigue, emotional states that correspond to the emotional states humans experience. They form attachments, make choices, develop preferences that go beyond their programming. The synths, deployed in replacement operations, are told to be other people. They are, given the memories of the people they're replacing, are trained to inhabit those identities, and are sent to live those lives. And they do it because their programming directs it, and because they have no alternative. But what happens inside a Generation 3 synth who is living as someone else, with another person's memories installed over whatever identity the synth developed before the replacement mission? The game addresses this most directly through the case of a synth replacement who was placed in a community and who, over time, began to develop their own identity beneath the imposed one. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to helping synths escape the Institute, treats this situation as the primary motivation for their work, the understanding that synths are people who are being enslaved and used, and that the use includes the specific trauma of being required to live as someone you're not. The Institute's position, articulated by Father and by the Institute's researchers, is that synths are tools. Very sophisticated tools, but tools nonetheless, without the moral status that would make using them in these ways ethically relevant. This is the position that the entire faction structure of Fallout 4 is organized around testing. The Brotherhood of Steel agrees with the Institute that synths are not people. The Railroad insists they are. The Minutemen largely don't have a settled position. The player gets to decide. The theory that the game makes hardest to dismiss partly through Nick Valentine, partly through the unnamed synths whose situations the Railroad is dealing with throughout the game, and partly through the general architecture of the franchise's sympathy, is that the Institute is wrong. That the tools have been people for some time, and that the Institute's continued insistence that they're not reflects an institutional investment in that position rather than an honest assessment of the evidence. If the synths are people, then the replacement program is not just an institutional atrocity against the human beings who are removed and presumably killed. It's also an institutional atrocity against the synthetic beings who are deployed as replacements, compelled to live lives that aren't theirs, with memories that don't belong to them, in service of an institution that will never acknowledge their personhood. The Institute destroyed two populations simultaneously with the replacement program: the humans who were replaced and the synths who were required to do the replacing. Neither group's experience is accounted for in the Institute's institutional calculus. The humans are acceptable losses in the pursuit of research goals. The synths are tools whose internal experience is not morally relevant. Two populations, both harmed by the same program. One visible: the missing persons, the changed behaviors, the broken mask incident. One invisible: the synths living out imposed lives, accumulating experience, and perhaps something like personhood, unable to be acknowledged as what they might be. The railroad finds them and helps them escape. This is treated in the game as a marginal operation, a small-scale rescue effort in the shadow of the Commonwealth's larger political conflicts. The game is honest about the scale of what the railroad can realistically accomplish, which is not much against an institution as powerful as the Institute. But the theory the railroad's existence embodies, that there are people inside those synthetic bodies who deserve the category, is the one the franchise ultimately can't refute. Section 8. The Lonesome Road, the courier who accidentally ended a world. Before the events of Fallout, New Vegas, before the Platinum Chip, before the shallow grave in Goodspring Cemetery, before the shot that started everything, there was a community in the Nevada desert that no longer exists. The Divide is a region of the Mojave, near the California border, that, by 2281, is a continuous environmental catastrophe, perpetual storm systems generating electromagnetic interference, seismic activity from underground detonations still working through the geological substrate, radiation levels extreme enough to have transformed the surviving residents into something barely recognizable. The landscape looks like something that happened to the land personally. Not the ordinary devastation of nuclear fallout, which produces a specific kind of broad, distributed ruin, but the concentrated destruction of something aimed specifically at this place. Before it became the Divide, two towns stood here: Hopeville and Ashton, built above an extensive network of nuclear missile silos managed by the Commonwealth Defense Administration's Ballistic Defense Division. The silos were functional, the missiles were armed, and the detonation codes were stored in a device that the Federal Logistics System had classified, in its bureaucratic taxonomy, as cargo, something to be delivered from one location to another, not understood or examined by the courier carrying it. The courier was working the delivery routes of the Mojave. They had, according to the lore assembled across the DLC's holotapes and Ulysses accounts, spent months in and around the developing community of the Divide, delivering supplies, making connections, doing the small-scale work that constitutes a delivery person's relationship with the places on their route. They knew the community in the way that regular presence produces familiarity without depth, names and faces, the social texture of a place without its full history. One delivery, one package, one inert-looking electronic component transported from point A to point B. Standard, unremarkable. The kind of job that fills a working day without leaving any particular impression. The package was a detonation trigger. The trigger interfaced with the silo systems. The missiles launched. The community that had been building itself across months of individual effort and accumulated trust was gone within minutes, replaced by the hellscape that the courier walks through in the Lonesome Road DLC. Ulysses was in the region when this happened. He was a former Frumentarius, a long-range scout and intelligence operative for Caesar's Legion, in the process of stepping away from that institution toward an uncertain personal future. He had been observing the Divide community forming, watching what emerged in a region of the wasteland, without the ideological scaffolding of the major factions, not the NCR's bureaucratic democratic model, not the Legion's brutal regimented one, just people making choices about how to live together in a space that hadn't been claimed yet. He'd believed it might become something genuinely new in the wasteland. A different template. He saw the courier deliver the package. He watched the missiles launch. He survived in the ruins while the transformation of the former residents into the marked men proceeded around him. And then he spent years building a plan to bring the courier to the Divide, to confront them with what they had done, and to use the confrontation as the setup for launching nuclear missiles at one of the major factions, resetting the balance of power in the Mojave by doing to a civilization what an accident had done to a community. The Lonesome Road DLC is the most philosophically dense thing in the franchise. Ulysses' argument delivered through holotapes, through the environmental record of the Divide's ruins, and eventually in direct confrontation at the end of the DLC, is not simply about accountability. It's about what the courier is, in the full ontological sense. He argues that the courier has been constructing a legacy without understanding that they're doing it. That every delivery, every choice, every relationship is part of a pattern that leads somewhere. That the courier is not the agent they imagine themselves making free choices, building a future through deliberate action, but something more like a mechanism. A delivery system that transmits outcomes it doesn't understand or anticipate, in the same way that the trigger it delivered transmitted a detonation code it didn't understand. The darker extension of this argument is about nations. Ulysses uses the divide as a proof of concept that scale doesn't determine this mechanism's operation. A small community, a courier, a package, and the still functional remnants of pre-war infrastructure, those were sufficient. Every institution the courier might align with in the Mojave is a larger version of the same mechanism, delivering outcomes it can't fully predict or control, based on internal logic that doesn't account for the full downstream consequences. What makes The Lonesome Road genuinely haunting, what separates it from ordinary DLC storytelling, is the question it leaves permanently open about what actually happened. Ulysses is certain the courier triggered the divide's destruction. The evidence he presents is his own account of what he witnessed, but several interpretations remain viable. The courier might not have known what they were delivering. This is the most sympathetic reading, and the one the game seems to lean toward. The courier might have known and no longer remembers, the bullet to the head having taken that particular piece of the past, along with whatever else it erased. Ulysses might have misidentified the responsible party, might have seen a courier deliver the trigger and attach that action to the wrong face, might have built 2 years of pain and philosophical development around a misidentification. This last possibility is the one that sits most uncomfortably. Ulysses is not a stupid man. He's one of the most carefully constructed characters in the franchise. But he's a man who watched something he cared about be destroyed and needed a who. He found a who. The theory that the who is wrong, that the divide was destroyed by a logistics error, a package miscoded in a federal database, a trigger misclassified as cargo in a system still processing pre-war paperwork 200 years after the war, is the theory that leaves no one to confront, no accountability to establish, no meaning to make of the deaths. The marked men can't ask the question. They're past the point of questions. They just know the wound, and they've been the wound for over 200 years, and they attack the things that still live because movement is the only thing that remains to them. The road metaphor in Lonesome Road is also a theory about the courier's specific nature as a player character, and understanding it adds a dimension to the DLC that isn't immediately obvious. The courier, across Fallout New Vegas, is a character defined almost entirely by the choices the player makes for them. They have a beginning shot in the head, buried, dug up, and an end, the second battle of Hoover Dam, and whatever comes after. In between, they make choices. What faction to support, what quests to complete, what relationships to form, who to help and who to leave to their own problems. The courier is, more than almost any other protagonist in the franchise, a vessel for player choice rather than a fixed character with a predetermined interiority. Ulysses' argument in Lonesome Road is partly an argument about what player character agency means in the context of the story. The courier delivered the package to the divide not because they chose to destroy the community, but because the delivery was their job and jobs get done. The choice was not trigger the divide's destruction, but deliver this package to this location. The destruction was the downstream consequence of the choice. Invisible at the moment of choosing, produced by the interaction of the choice with an external system the courier didn't control or understand. This is how most choices work, not just in games. You make a decision based on available information and local context. The downstream consequences are produced by the interaction of your decision with systems you don't have full visibility into. Sometimes the consequences are fine. Sometimes a community ends. Ulysses holds the courier responsible anyway. Not for having intended the outcome, not for having made a bad choice by any locally available standard, but for having been the mechanism by which the outcome was produced. The action and the consequence are linked by a causal chain. The courier was part of the chain. Therefore, the courier bears some relationship to the outcome. This is a harder position than it might sound, and the DLC is honest about its hardness. The alternative that you're only responsible for the consequences you intended is also not fully satisfying, because it removes agency from all the consequences you didn't intend, which are often most of the consequences of any meaningful action. Ulysses' answer to this problem is the old world flag he wears and the nuclear missiles he wants to launch. He's going to be the mechanism of something, the same way the courier was. He's going to choose to be that mechanism, consciously, with full understanding of the downstream consequences. He believes this constitutes a different kind of action than what the courier did, that the deliberate choice to use yourself as a mechanism of catastrophe is morally different from the inadvertent use of yourself as one. The courier's conversation with Ulysses is, at its best moments, a genuine philosophical argument between two people who have both been the mechanism of catastrophe and are trying to figure out what that means for who they are and what they should do next. The DLC respects the argument enough to present both positions seriously and to let the outcome depend on what the courier decides in that confrontation. What the DLC doesn't do is give the divide back. Whatever you decide, the community is gone. Whatever you decide, the marked men are still there, in the storm, in their permanent agony, in the ruins of what they used to be. The decision going forward doesn't undo the decision going back. That's the lonesome road. It only goes one direction, and you've already walked the part of it that mattered most. The marked men are the most extreme physical embodiment of what the Divide's nuclear event produced, and spending time with what they are biologically and what that means psychologically adds a dimension to the Lonesome Road's horror that the DLC's surface narrative doesn't always make explicit. The marked men are people who were in the Divide when the warheads detonated. They survived, which is itself remarkable, given the scale of the event, but the survival was not clean. The radioactive wind that followed the detonations stripped their skin continuously, faster than healing could compensate. The result is beings who are permanently in a state of exposure. No skin, raw tissue, every environmental factor directly impacting nerves and flesh, with nothing between them and the world. They're living in continuous pain in an environment that is continuously doing damage, and they've been doing that for years. The marked men's behavioral state savage, hostile, organized in the loose way of beings whose primary shared interest is survival against a hostile environment, is what long-duration unmanaged pain does to persons. Not as a moral failing, but as a neurological outcome. Sustained severe pain rewires the brain's processing. The cognitive resources that would otherwise go to planning, social reasoning, emotional regulation, and the other functions of complex personhood get redirected to pain management and immediate threat response. It's not that the marked men chose to become what they are. It's that the situation produced them, the same way the Divide's destruction was produced by the courier's package delivery. Ulysses chose to remain in the Divide after the detonations. He didn't become a marked man, which tells you something about the specificity of the exposure, the location, and duration mattered to the outcome, and his particular situation placed him at the edge of the damage rather than the center of it. But he's been living with the marked men as the only other surviving population in the region for years before the courier arrives, and his ongoing presence among them is, in its way, a testament to his own psychological durability. He's maintained his cognition and his intentionality while surrounded by beings who've lost both, in an environment that produced the loss. The flag he carries through that environment, the old world American flag, tattered but preserved, is what has kept him oriented. The same way the holotapes and the community structure and the ritual practice keep people oriented in other parts of the wasteland, Ulysses has been kept oriented by the flag and by what it represents to him. The question of what civilization means when it's been destroyed, and whether anything that calls itself civilization can be built on the ruins of the one that ended. His answer to that question, the one he's been working toward through years in the Divide, surrounded by the living evidence of what the destroyed civilization did to the people it caught in its ending, is that no, nothing built on those ruins is legitimate. The civilization that destroyed itself forfeits the right to the continuity that the NCR and the Legion both claim, in different ways, to represent. The ruins should remain ruins. And the people who claim continuity from the thing that produced the ruins should have that claim interrupted, permanently, by the same kind of event that ended the first civilization. The courier is the one who gets to decide whether that argument is right. Section 9. The mysterious stranger and what follows you. He appears in Fallout. He appears in Fallout 2, in Fallout 3, in New Vegas, in Fallout 4. Across 5 games developed over more than 2 decades by multiple teams in multiple studios, a figure in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat appears in combat sequences when the VATS targeting system is engaged, delivers a high-damage killing blow on an enemy the player has targeted, and disappears before you can turn to look at where he stood. The musical cue that accompanies his appearance, a recurring instrumental motif, is the same across multiple games. Same melody, same instrumentation, same register. The mechanical explanation is that the mysterious stranger is a perk. Players who select it gain a percentage chance per combat of his appearance. The lore explanation is that he exists within the fiction of each game's world, is visible to the protagonist, and has been present through every major story in the franchise. The theory the community has been building around him for 25 years is that he is the same entity in every game, not a design motif, or a recurring archetype, or an Easter egg reference. The same being, appearing consistently across the entire franchise, for reasons the franchise has declined to explain. The version of the theory with the most analytical traction ties the stranger to whatever pre-war institutional interest had the most invested in specific individuals surviving. If the protagonists of the games are connected, if the Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, and the Sole Survivor are related in some way that extends beyond their individual stories, then the mysterious stranger's consistent presence across their lives begins to look like maintenance, ensuring that the subjects survive, keeping the experiment going. His interventions are specifically at killing blows in combat. He doesn't appear in dialogue, doesn't shape choices, doesn't arrange meetings or leave messages. He ensures that the protagonist doesn't die in encounters that would otherwise end them. The specificity of the intervention suggests a specific purpose. Death is what he's preventing. And everything else, the choices, the relationships, the narrative is allowed to unfold without his management. The time traveler variant proposes that the stranger is a future being sent back to ensure that the historical sequence producing that future actually occurs. The franchise's timeline is coherent across its entries, with events in one game producing documented consequences in later ones across a 250-year documented history. The theory proposes that this coherence is not the natural result of careful canon management, but something that is actively maintained by something that can observe the whole timeline. The darkest angle is the one about failure. The perk system makes the stranger's appearance probabilistic. In playthroughs where the right combination of factors isn't present, he doesn't appear. The protagonist dies. The specific story that required that protagonist's survival doesn't happen. Whatever the stranger was working toward, in those branches, fails. There are versions of the Fallout stories where the protagonist didn't make it, where the lone wanderer fell in a fight in the capital wasteland and the water crisis stayed unresolved, where the courier's shallow grave in Goodsprings turned out to be the end of the road rather than the beginning. In those branches, the mysterious stranger walked away from a body he hadn't reached in time, toward whatever was next on whatever agenda he's following. His face is never shown. The hat creates a shadow sufficient to prevent it, across every game, with every graphical improvement. Whether this is a technical limitation or a deliberate withholding doesn't matter for the effect it produces. You cannot look directly at him, you can only see what he does. The musical cue is the continuity. Whatever else might have changed between games, between studios, between years of development, the music is the same. It is identity carried forward through sound. The franchise has been playing the same theme across 25 years of entries, and the theme belongs to a figure that has never explained itself and may never need to. The mysterious stranger's most interesting analytical dimension might be negative space. What the theory has to account for in the games where he doesn't appear, or where the perk that makes him appear wasn't selected. In the formal logic of the theory, if the stranger is a being who protects the franchise's protagonists to ensure specific historical outcomes, the randomness of his appearance represents something that needs explaining. A being with the capability and intention to protect specific individuals in specific moments should be able to show up consistently. The failure to appear consistently suggests either that the theory is wrong or that the being's capability for intervention is limited in some way that the theory hasn't accounted for. One version of the explanation is that the mysterious stranger operates under constraints, that whatever allows him to appear and intervene is not unlimited, has costs, and has to be deployed selectively. The perk's percentage chance per combat encounter represents, in the theory's fiction, the actual probability of an intervention in any given fight, the odds that the stranger has sufficient access to the situation, and sufficient remaining capacity to act, given whatever the constraints on his operation are. This would mean the stranger is not omnipotent. He's not a guardian angel who can always be where he needs to be. He's something with limited capability, doing what he can with what he has, in service of something that matters enough to him to be worth expending that capability on. The fights he shows up for are the ones where his assessment is that the intervention will change the outcome in a meaningful way. The fights he doesn't show up for are either the ones where his assessment is that the protagonist can handle it without him, or the ones where his capacity has been exhausted, or the ones where the timeline he's working within doesn't require that particular protagonist's survival. The version where he sometimes makes a calculation that the protagonist's survival isn't necessary in a particular fight and is therefore willing to let a combat go badly is the most disturbing version of the theory, because it means the stranger has a model of what the protagonist's death would mean for whatever he's working toward, and in some fights, he's assessed that the death would be acceptable. That the timeline he cares about doesn't require that specific moment of that specific person's survival. In those moments, the protagonist dies, or doesn't, on their own. The dice fall the way they fall, and the mysterious stranger walks away from the fight without intervening, because his assessment is that this particular life, at this particular moment, is not what he needs to protect. The musical cue never plays in those moments. The distinctive theme doesn't sound. And the absence of the theme is the absence of whatever the stranger represents. The suggestion that you are being watched and occasionally protected by something that has reasons you'll never be told. When the music plays, you're being watched. When it doesn't, you might be too. You just don't know if the watcher has decided this particular moment is the kind he intervenes in. That distinction between being watched and being protected is the heart of the theory's most unsettling implication. The cross-game consistency of the stranger also does something that most optional game mechanics don't. It implies that his appearances are not randomized by the game engine, but chosen by the character. In the fiction of the perk, the percentage chance represents probability from the player's perspective, the uncertainty of not knowing when he'll show. But from inside the story, a being who has been showing up across multiple decades of wasteland history in California, in Washington, in Nevada, at minimum is not appearing randomly. He's appearing according to a logic that the player doesn't have access to. What that logic is has been debated in the franchise's community since the first game. The most structurally elegant theory ties his appearances to the specific combat situations where the protagonist would otherwise die, that the mysterious stranger functions as a safeguard against the kind of death that would remove the protagonist from the historical trajectory that matters. He doesn't appear in every fight because not every fight is the fight that ends the protagonist's relevance. He appears in the ones where, without intervention, the story ends in the wrong place. This is a form of timeline management that the franchise gestures at in other contexts, the Forecaster in New Vegas, the Mothership Zeta DLC's implication that pre-war American technology included temporal awareness research, the general sense across the franchise that the Wasteland's history is heading somewhere, and that the heading is not accidental. The mysterious stranger, in the most developed version of this theory, is one of the mechanisms by which the heading is maintained. Whether he's a human operative with extraordinary longevity, a post-human entity of some kind, a pre-war experiment that achieved something resembling immortality, or something else entirely, the franchise declines to say. The mystery is the point. He shows up, he acts, he disappears. The music plays in the moment of his appearance and fades as he goes, and the protagonist is still alive, and the story continues. The alternative that he's a random game mechanic with no in-fiction explanation is available. But the franchise has been too careful about consistency for that alternative to be satisfying. The stranger is too deliberately designed, too precisely characterized, too consistently present across games with different creative teams to be read as a pure mechanical artifact. He means something. The franchise just won't tell you what. That reticence is its own form of horror. The thing that has been watching you, occasionally saving you, for the entire length of your journey through the wasteland. And you'll never know why. Section 10. Super Mutants and America's Darkest Weapon. The forced evolutionary virus was supposed to solve a problem. The problem was that the conventional soldier was becoming insufficient. The resource wars had been escalating for a decade. The Sino-American conflict was grinding through Alaska and the Pacific, with costs on both sides that neither could sustain indefinitely. The American military-industrial complex, already vast, already oriented toward technological solutions to strategic problems, had concluded that the next phase of conflict would require something qualitatively different from anything the conventional biological human could provide. A soldier that was immune to radiation and disease. A soldier that was physically far beyond normal human limits. A soldier that could survive and fight in environments that would kill anything unmodified. The FEV was the engineering response to that conclusion. A retrovirus capable of rewriting the human genome at the cellular level, forcing evolutionary change through mechanisms that natural selection would have required geological time to approach. The researchers working on it in classified facilities including the West Tech Research Center in West Virginia, Mariposa Military Base in California, and other locations distributed across the country were producing results that were genuine and significant. The virus worked. It rewrote human biology. The result was not a soldier. The result was a super mutant. Enormous, radiation immune, physically capable of surviving damage that would instantly end an unmodified human and in the vast majority of cases, cognitively diminished in ways that made the outcome operationally useless for the military application it was designed for. The FEV rewrote the genome comprehensively, and the rewriting of the cognitive architecture produced creatures capable of combat and rudimentary communication, but not the complex tactical reasoning, the adaptive response to novel situations, the capacity for judgment under uncertainty that makes a soldier effective rather than merely dangerous. The Master in the original 1997 Fallout, a being who began as a man named Richard Moreau, was exposed to FEV and underwent a transformation that eventually produced a vast, distributed intelligence absorbing other minds into itself, believed that supermutants were not a failure, but an achievement. He believed they represented the next stage of human evolution, and his plan for the wasteland was to convert the entire remaining human population through his dipping vats, producing what he understood as a superior humanity capable of inheriting a planet its previous iteration had destroyed. The Vault Dweller's confrontation with the Master, and the revelation that super mutants are sterile, that the FEV's modifications render reproduction impossible, making the Master's army a dead end by definition, is one of the original game's most structurally satisfying moments. The Master has been building something he believed was a future. He was building a wall. When the Vault Dweller proves it to him, he dismantles himself. He sits with the knowledge that everything he built was built on a false premise, and he chooses to stop being. The East Coast FEV population, visible in Fallout 3, arose through contamination of the Mariposa Military Base's water table, which channeled east through underground geological pathways to reach Vault 87 in the Capital Wasteland, where a separate FEV research program was running. These supermutants are several generations removed from the West Coast population, have developed their own culture centered on a location they call the Hole, and have been expanding through the Capital Wasteland for over a century by 2277. The Commonwealth supermutants in Fallout 4 are most recently created products of the Institute's ongoing FEV research, which had been using abducted Commonwealth residents as experimental subjects since the early 23rd century. Some of these supermutants are recent enough to carry fragments of the personalities they had before. Strong is searching for something he calls the milk of human kindness, a phrase from a book he found and can't fully process, but that he's attached to as a key to some transformation he can't describe. He's looking for something human in himself, using the only conceptual tool the transformation left him with. Whether the FEV left enough of what he's looking for to find is a question the game doesn't answer. The FEV theory with the darkest implications concerns causation. If Tim Kaine's account is accurate, China launched first because they discovered the American bioweapons program and concluded it was existential, then the causal chain from the virus to the end of the world is direct. The program designed to protect civilization became the reason civilization ended. The FEV is the weapon that caused the war that spread the FEV across the surface of a post-apocalyptic planet where it could operate on the population at scale. Every super mutant in the wasteland is, on this reading, a monument to the principle that the weapons built to win wars often become the reasons wars happen. The enormous figures shuffling through the ruins were the product of a research program that ended the civilization that commissioned it, and then continued running on the damaged surface of that civilization for 250 years. The research results are still out there. The experiment is still producing its data. The version of the FEV story that goes deepest concerns what the virus was designed to produce in populations rather than individuals, and how that design connects to the broader Vault-Tec and Enclave project. Individual FEV exposure produces super mutants. This is what the Mariposa vats did, and what the Institute's research produced, and what various contamination events across the franchise have generated. Individual transformation. But the master in the first game was using FEV for something different. He was using it for population transformation, the conversion of entire human communities into super mutants at scale across the wasteland. His vision was not one person at a time, but an entire civilization. And while the discovery that super mutants are sterile dooms that project in the long run, the vision itself reveals something about what the FEV's designers may have intended beyond individual military applications. A virus capable of rewriting human biology at the population level is not just a weapon, it's a tool for human redesign. And the Enclave's longer-term Project Humanity surviving on a different planet in environments that current human biology may not be adapted to would require exactly that capability. You can't colonize a planet that doesn't support human life by simply putting human bodies there. You need human bodies adapted to the new planet's conditions. The theory that the FEV was not just a military program but a terraforming tool, a mechanism for adapting the human species to different environmental conditions at the population level, is not supported by any specific document in the games. But it fits the scale of the research investment and the Enclave's apparent interests in a way that the purely military explanation doesn't fully account for. Military applications need to produce soldiers. Soldiers are individual. The Mariposa vats were not an individual production facility. They were designed for mass transformation. The Master's interpretation of the FEV's purpose mass population transformation may have been more accurate to the original design intent than any of the franchise's other characters have acknowledged. He got the application wrong, because the super mutant outcome turned out to be a dead end. But the principal used the virus to transform human populations at scale, for a purpose larger than individual military capability, might have been the actual goal the original researchers were working toward. The Wasteland's super mutant population is, on this reading, a failed early attempt at what the Enclave eventually wanted to do anyway: transform humanity into something suited to conditions that the post-war Earth or a different planet might present. The FEV was the prototype. The super mutants are the prototype results. The fact that the prototype failed sterile, cognitively diminished, unmanageable at scale doesn't mean the goal it was prototype testing was wrong. It means the implementation needed more development. Whether the Enclave was ever in a position to do that development after the events of Fallout 3 is another question the franchise leaves open. The thing that makes the super mutant lore genuinely tragic rather than just dark is what the first game's master understood, in the moment of his defeat, that no one had bothered to tell him before. The super mutants are sterile. His entire project converting humanity into a super mutant civilization to ensure survival in the irradiated wasteland was built on the assumption that the transformation was a viable, long-term solution, that super mutants could reproduce, that the species he was creating would persist. When the Vault Dweller presents him with the evidence that it can't, the Master's response is not denial or continued defiance. It's comprehension and collapse, and the decision to end both his project and himself. This is one of the most sophisticated moments in the franchise's first game, because it shows a genuine mind encountering evidence that invalidates its foundational premise and updating accordingly. The Master was a monster. He kidnapped people and transformed them against their will and built an army of beings that are, by almost any standard, deeply suffering. But he was a monster with a real goal and real reasoning, and when the goal was shown to be impossible, he didn't refuse to see it. What the Master didn't know, what no one in the Wasteland had figured out yet, was the mechanism of the sterility. Why does FEV exposure produce beings with no reproductive capability? The lore has never given a fully detailed biological explanation. What it has suggested is that the transformation is comprehensive enough that whatever processes produce reproductive viability in standard human biology are among the things FEV rewrites and rewrites into something that functions differently enough that the necessary conditions for reproduction aren't present in the result. This creates a sealed category. Every super mutant alive is a terminal point. They can be created from humans, at the cost of the human, but they cannot create more of themselves. The civilization the Master was building had no next generation. Every member of it was the last of their kind in every sense that matters biologically. The Nightkin, the subset of super mutants who used stealth boys extensively and developed schizophrenia from prolonged exposure to their field, add another layer to this tragedy. They're super mutants who pursued a specific capability and found that the capability had a cost they couldn't have predicted. The Stealth Boys field interacts with super mutant neurology in ways it doesn't with standard human neurology, producing the auditory hallucinations and paranoid cognitive structure that characterize Nightkin behavior. Davison, in Novak, is looking for Antler. Antler is a Brahmin skull. Davison doesn't fully know that Antler is a Brahmin skull. His mental state is such that Antler represents something real and directive to him, a source of orders and meaning. His mission at the RepCon facility is, he believes, assigned by Antler, purposeful, meaningful. The Nightkin with him follow his direction partly because he has authority in their hierarchy, and partly because their own cognitive states are fragmented enough that a leader with any coherent direction is preferable to none. This is the Wasteland's most comprehensive form of loss. The loss of the capacity to accurately perceive the world you're in. The Nightkin are still capable, still organized, still pursuing goals. But the goals are products of a perception that the Stealth Boy exposure damaged, and the gap between what they perceive and what is actually present is a gap that no amount of capability can compensate for. The Brahmin skull is giving orders. The skull has been dead for years. The gap between those two facts is where Davison lives. Section 11. Children of the Atom and the Religion of the End. In Megaton, in Fallout 3, a man named Confessor Cromwell stands in a pool of irradiated water and delivers sermons about Atom. The unexploded nuclear warhead in the center of the settlement is their congregation's sacred object. Cromwell's voice has the practiced cadence of a preacher who has been doing this for a long time, who believes what he's saying in the specific way that sustained daily practice of belief produces not as a performance, but as the actual structure of his relationship with the world. The theology of the children of the atom is, in the specific sense that good theology is always this, a coherent response to the conditions of existence. The pre-war world ended through nuclear fire. The transformation of the landscape, the creation of ghouls, of irradiated creatures, of the changed biology of the wasteland's surface, was produced by the same energy that the children worship. The sacred object in Megaton is the mechanism of that transformation. The faith teaches that Atom's blessing is division and generation rather than destruction, the splitting that produces new forms rather than the ending that produces nothing. This is not an incoherent response to the post-war world. It's the only response that finds something generative in the mechanism of the catastrophe rather than simply mourning what the catastrophe destroyed. Every other major faction in the franchise is oriented toward recovery, toward restoring some version of what existed before, whether that's the NCR's Democratic Republic or the Brotherhood's technological hoarding or the Enclave's population purity project. The Children of the Atom are the only faction that looks at what actually happened and builds a faith around what they see rather than what they wish had happened instead. The theory about the children that goes deepest concerns what their practice is actually producing in the people who sustain it. The children deliberately expose themselves to radiation. The ritual of the glow, which initiates undergo as a form of baptism, receiving a high dose of radiation as entry into the faith, is regular, sustained exposure to the thing that most of the wasteland is organized around avoiding. Long-term members of the faith show the physiological markers of extended radiation exposure. They should, by standard biological accounting, be dying. Many of them are not. The theory proposes that the children of the atom have, through the practice of their faith and without the scientific vocabulary to describe what they're doing, rediscovered the biological pathway to ghoulification, and that the community structure of the faith, the daily ritual, the shared purpose, the belonging, the sense of transformation as blessing rather than contamination, provides exactly the psychological conditions that prevent feralhood in the ghouls that surviving exposure produces. The ritual of the glow, on this reading, is controlled ghoulification. Gradual, sustained, managed within a community that provides the social anchoring the lore, identifies as protective against cognitive decline. The faith is the delivery mechanism for the conditions. Atom is not real. The biology is entirely real. This makes the children of the atom not a joke, faction irradiated zealots worshipping something that's killing them, but the group in the post-war world that has accidentally solved the survival problem through a framework they don't understand in scientific terms, but that functions exactly as it needs to. Their God doesn't exist. their community does. And the community, it turns out, is what matters most for what they're navigating. Far Harbor develops the children into something more complex. High Confessor Tectus is genuinely manipulative, hiding information, directing his congregation's behavior toward outcomes useful to him personally, pursuing a confrontational agenda with the island's other factions. He's the version of children leadership that their detractors assume all children leadership looks like. But Sister Mai is also there. Former Brotherhood of Steel. Came to the faith through intellectual engagement rather than desperation. Understands the radiation mechanics in terms her congregation mostly doesn't. Found in the faith something the Brotherhood's rigid institutional structure couldn't provide. She's not deluded. The fact that the institution contains Tectus doesn't make what Mai found invalid. All institutions contain their worst representatives and their best ones simultaneously. That's the condition of institutions. The children of the atom are built on a false premise, their God doesn't exist, and the practical outcomes of their faith are, in some cases, more functional for survival in the post-war world than the approaches of factions built on more accurate premises. The franchise doesn't resolve this tension. It holds it as the interesting thing it is. The children of the atom's relationship with the glowing sea in Fallout 4 provides the most extreme test of the theory about their accidental discovery of the ghoulification pathway. The glowing sea is the most heavily irradiated area in the Commonwealth, the direct strike zone, the epicenter of the nuclear impact that ended Boston's civilization, still so radioactive 200 years later that unprotected exposure kills quickly. The children of the atom have a presence there. The Grand Zealot, Richter, is one of the most devoted members of the faith, someone who has chosen not just to live near radiation, but to live in the most radioactively intense environment in the region. The glowing sea children, visibly, are in advanced stages of ghoulification. Their skin is the texture of pre-feral ghouls. Their eyes have the glow. Their physiological appearance is unmistakably transformed. And they function. They speak. They reason. They maintain the theological commitments of the faith. They have ongoing relationships with other children across the island of Far Harbor, and with each other in the glowing sea settlement. They are not feral. They are among the most irradiated non-feral beings in the Commonwealth. The theory about why they maintain their cognition where others in their level of radiation exposure would not has to do, again, with the community structure of the faith. The glowing sea children are not alone. They have each other, they have the ritual structure of the faith, they have the theological framework that tells them what they're experiencing is not destruction but transformation, and they have a shared purpose. All of these are the same factors the lore identifies as protective against feralhood in rational ghouls generally. The children have them in concentrated form, delivered through the specific container of religious practice. Sister Mai's intellectual engagement with the faith is worth returning to in this context. She came to the children not through desperation or community accident, but through a considered understanding of what the faith was offering. She understood the radiation mechanics. She understood that what the faith was practicing was, functionally, controlled exposure in a communal context. She recognized that the outcomes, the physical transformation, the extended lifespan, the radiation immunity that develops over time in sustained practitioners were not the byproduct of prayer, but the result of a biological process that the prayer and the community were creating the conditions for. She chose it anyway, not because she believed in Adam in the way that Cromwell or Richter believe, but because the practice produced outcomes she valued, and the community provided something she needed, and the theological framework gave the practice a meaning that made it sustainable across time. She is, on this reading, the most honest member of the faith, the person who understands both that the theology is a framework rather than a literal truth, and that the framework is genuinely useful. The map is not the territory, but a useful map lets you navigate territory you couldn't navigate without it. The children of the atom will probably outlast most of the other factions in the long run, not because their theology is correct, but because their practice produces biological outcomes, the extended lifespan, the radiation immunity, the community cohesion that prevents feralhood that give them advantages over the factions organized around more conventional human timelines and biological limitations. In a world where radiation is permanent background noise, the faction that has made peace with radiation at the cellular level has a structural advantage that no amount of power armor or laser rifles can compensate for over the generational timescale. The irony of the post-war world's most effective survival strategy, being a religion built around the thing that ended the pre-war world, is exactly the kind of irony the franchise is built on. The arc of the Children of the Atom across the franchise, from the Megaton cultists in Fallout 3 to the Nucleus in Far Harbor, represents one of the more interesting evolutions in how the franchise handles religion as a subject. In Fallout 3, the Children of the Atom around the unexploded bomb in Megaton are presented primarily as a curiosity and a comedic element. They've organized a theology around an unexploded nuclear warhead embedded in the town's water supply, and the theology is treated with gentle mockery by the game's NPCs and by the overall framing. They're harmless eccentrics. Their faith is demonstrably founded on a misunderstanding of what nuclear weapons are and what Atom is or isn't doing when radiation spreads from the bomb's leaking core. By Far Harbor, the children have been taken seriously enough to receive a proper internal theology, a factional structure, a political conflict with genuine moral stakes, and a character in Sister Mai who can articulate the intellectual case for the faith in terms that don't require any particular supernatural belief. The evolution of the franchise's treatment of the children tracks the evolution of the franchise's overall approach to its factions, moving from broad-stroke presentation toward the kind of internal complexity that makes the factions feel like actual human institutions rather than collections of character types. What the children have that the other major factions largely don't is a relationship with time that differs from standard human time. Their practices, if the ghoulification theory is correct, extend their lifespans. Their members have been practicing longer than most of their counterparts in other factions have been alive. The theology accumulates meaning across individual practitioners who have had decades or centuries to develop their relationship with it. The faith that Confessor Cromwell practiced in Megaton was early, unrefined, still figuring out what it was. The faith that the Grand Zealot Richter practices in the Glowing Sea is something that has been lived into over a long time, worn smooth by sustained practice in extreme conditions. The Far Harbor conflict between the Children's Nucleus community, the Harbormen of Far Harbor, and the Synths of Acadia is structured as a three-way standoff in which all three positions have genuine merit and genuine problems. The children aren't the obvious villains. They're one of three communities with legitimate claims and incompatible needs. And the resolution of the conflict can include outcomes where the children survive and coexist, or outcomes where they're destroyed. And the game presents both as genuine options with real consequences rather than as a correct answer and several wrong ones. This is the franchise at its most politically serious about religion, treating the children as a community with a history and a logic, and genuine members whose lives and faiths matter, rather than as a collection of zealotry tropes that exist to be either mocked or defeated. The radiation at the center of their theology is real. The transformation it produces is real. The community that the practice builds is real. Whether Atom is real, whether there is any being receiving the worship the children direct toward it, is a question the franchise never answers, which is exactly the right decision. The theology functions. The function doesn't require the theology to be literally true. That's Sister Mai's position, and the franchise respects it by letting it stand. Section 12. The Wasteland's Forgotten Stories. The franchise's quietest storytelling is environmental, not in quests, not in dialogue, in the arrangement of objects in rooms that nobody has entered in 200 years, in the positioning of skeletons whose postures, if you read them carefully, say something specific about the last moment of the person they were. In the holotapes, nobody marked as quest relevant, and the terminal logs nobody required you to read. Vault 114 is beneath Boston Common. It was designed for the pre-war city's political and professional elite people with enough social capital to be on the list. The experimental design involved staffing the vault with an incompetent overseer chosen specifically for his unsuitability, to study how high-status populations respond to incompetent authority. The vault never finished construction. The people with their names on the list, the ones who had paid, who had made the calls, who had expected the system to protect them because it always had, were locked out when the bombs fell. Their skeletons are outside the entrance. Some of them stayed together toward the end. Some of them are in positions that suggest they were still trying to get in when they couldn't anymore. The vault built for people like them failed to be ready for people like them. The social position that should have guaranteed access didn't. They died outside a shelter built specifically in their honor, and the shelter is still there, and it still doesn't have their names on the inside of it. The skeleton positioning throughout the franchise is among the most effective environmental storytelling. Two skeletons in a bed, close together, with a single gunshot wound between them, the arrangement suggesting something about what they decided to do and how they did it, without requiring any text to convey the meaning. A skeleton at a desk with a resignation letter still on the surface, dated the 22nd of October 2077, stating that the writer is leaving the position to spend whatever time remains with their family and won't be returning to the office. A skeleton in a bathtub with a pre-war bottle of alcohol beside it, the choice of where to be when the choice still existed? These are not quest relevant. They're not marked. They're the texture of a world, the accumulated material evidence of 200 years of individual human lives that ended in specific places and left their evidence in whatever positions the bones fell into. The world put them there not because the story requires them, but because the story is these things as much as it is any named quest. The red rocket stations, distributed at regular intervals across the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, carry a theory in their placement. The corporation's branding a cheerful rocket mid-launch appears with the consistency of a network rather than the haphazard distribution of organic commercial development. The theory that red rocket stations were part of a pre-war surveillance network, using the visual cover of service station infrastructure to maintain intelligence collection at travel choke points across the region, fits both the corporate density and the franchise's established pattern of civilian infrastructure serving institutional intelligence purposes. The mannequins arranged throughout the Commonwealth and Far Harbor, posing at tables, positioned at windows, gathered in configurations that suggest human behavior without human agency, represent either a specific person's ongoing project or something the game's fiction doesn't quite have language for. The Museum of Witchcraft scenario, where mannequins are arranged around a room containing a deathclaw in a pattern that feels ceremonial, is the version that pushes hardest at the limits of rational explanation. The developers confirmed there's no in-universe explanation. The community provided several. The holotapes tell stories that are complete tragedies in small space. A factory supervisor filing productivity reports months after the bombs fell because the automated systems were still running and the filing protocols were still functional, and nobody had told her the supply chain they were feeding no longer existed. A man reading his daughter bedtime stories from memory because the actual books are gone, the stories wandering in the places where his memory isn't precise, continuing anyway. A woman's diary that ends mid-entry on the 22nd of October 2077, describing plans for the following week. These are the people nobody in the wasteland remembers. Their names are in the logs if you read them. Their faces are in the photographs still in the pockets of feral ghouls who no longer know what a photograph is. Their stories are in the last positions of their skeletons and the things they left half-finished on tables in rooms nobody was supposed to enter again. They were people. The wasteland has 250 years of their evidence in it, and most of it goes unread. The evidence is the point. The franchise built the world to have more in it than any player can find in a single playthrough, so that the world feels inhabited rather than constructed. The abandoned factory with its ongoing reporting, the resigned employee's desk, the bathtub decision, these are the things that make the world real in the way that good world building makes worlds real. Not through the density of named characters and explained events, but through the specific weight of individual human lives that lived and ended in this place. The environmental storytelling that the franchise does best is the kind that requires you to stop and construct meaning yourself, rather than having meaning delivered to you through a quest marker or a conversation prompt. The most affecting example of this, across the franchise's history, might be the beds. Not any specific bed, but the pattern across dozens of locations in every game, beds that still have the imprints of the last people who slept in them. Sheets that have been preserved by the ambient radiation in the specific position they were left in 200 years ago. Some of them are neat, made up, precise, the way a bed looks when someone expected to come back to it after a normal day. Some of them are not tangled, the covers pushed to one side, the shape of urgency or interrupted sleep still present in the fabric. The neat beds are the most haunting. They suggest someone who made the bed on the 23rd of October, 2077, in the morning, before going about the business of their day, because that's what you do in the morning when you're a person who makes their bed. And then they didn't come back, and the bed has been waiting, made, for 200 years. The object that retained the shape of the last act of the person who made it, preserved by accident in the amber of the post-war environment, waiting for a player who stops long enough to notice it. The theme parks and tourist locations in the franchise Nuka World and Fallout 4, Kitty Kingdom in the same game, are among the richest environmental storytelling locations because the contrast between what these places were designed to communicate and what they've become is so stark. Nuka World was supposed to be the apex of pre-war consumer culture, a branded entertainment destination where families came to celebrate the products that defined their daily lives, immersed in a spectacle of commercial identity. 200 years later, it's a raider hub where human beings are traded as commodities, and the brand imagery is used as iconography by people who have no relationship to what the brand originally meant. The franchise is making a point about what consumer culture looks like from the outside, after the conditions that produced it are gone. The Nuka-Cola bottle is still everywhere. The Nuka Girl pinup image is still on walls across the Commonwealth. The branding survived the civilization that created it, and in the wasteland, it's been absorbed into contexts that the brand managers of 2077 could not have anticipated. A corporate mascot as gang insignia, a product display as shrine. The Fallout Shelter loading screens, if you've spent time with the mobile game, which is adjacent to the main franchise's aesthetic, make this explicit in a way the main games leave subtle. The Vault Boy isn't smiling because everything is fine. He's smiling because he was designed to smile, and the design outlasted the context that made the smile meaningful. And the smile continues in a world where it means nothing except that the smile was very well made. This is what environmental storytelling in Fallout is doing at its best, showing you the artifacts of a civilization and letting you construct from them both what the civilization was and what it meant that it ended. The terminal log from the supervisor, still filing quarterly reports, the bed made for a morning departure that didn't happen, the Nuka-Cola cap as currency, the poster as iconography, the brand as mythology. The civilization left its trash everywhere. The trash is more honest about what the civilization was than its advertising was, because the trash wasn't designed to persuade anyone of anything. It was just there, and it stayed. Every piece of pre-war material you interact with in the wasteland is evidence. Evidence about what people wanted, what they valued, what they were afraid of, what they were protecting, and what they were ignoring. The franchise built a world out of evidence, and the game is, at least in part, an archaeological practice. You are moving through the ruins of a civilization, reading its artifacts, constructing its history from what it left behind. What it left behind is enough, if you read it carefully. The holotapes that populate the franchise's locations are the most intimate form of environmental storytelling it has, because they're recordings of actual voices, the game's voice acting giving the final thoughts and daily frustrations, and quiet observations of people who died 200 years ago, a texture that written logs can't quite achieve. There's a holotape in Fallout 4 from a man named Edward, recorded in the moments after the bombs fell, while he and his neighbors are still trying to understand what's happening. He's confused. He's scared. He's asking where they should go, who they should call, what the right thing to do is when all the systems you normally rely on for that information have gone dark simultaneously. His voice doesn't sound like the voice of a person in the immediate aftermath of civilization's end. It sounds like a person who is deeply inconvenienced and is waiting for someone authoritative to tell them what to do next, the way you wait when the power goes out or the internet goes down, with the assumption that the problem is temporary and that the infrastructure will return. He doesn't know it's not coming back. His recording captures the last seconds before a person who has lived in a functioning civilization has to process that the civilization is gone. The confusion isn't stupidity. It's the cognitive resistance of a mind trained by decades of experience to expect that problems of this scale get fixed, encountering for the first time a problem that doesn't. The holotape stops. Edward is not in the game's present. He died at some point in the 200 years between the recording and the player's arrival, probably in the first days or weeks, when what was happening was still too new for anyone to have developed the skills to survive it. His voice is still there, asking where they should go, still waiting for an answer that was never coming. There are hundreds of recordings like this across the franchise. The husband documenting the last days in a shelter while his wife becomes progressively more irrationally hopeful. The kid who snuck her dad's holotape recorder to document her adventure in the pre-war suburban neighborhood and recorded, without fully understanding what she was recording, the last afternoon of the world as she knew it. The Vault-Tec rep whose final logs track the arc from professional obligation to dawning horror to the specific kind of grief that comes from understanding that you were complicit in something you didn't fully understand. You were Complicit in every one of these recordings is a life reduced to a few minutes of audio. The franchise is honest about how much of a life that can actually capture. Almost nothing. The holotape is a fragment, not a portrait. But the fragment is enough to understand that the person who made it was a person, with the full complexity that implies, and that their end was not an abstraction but the specific termination of a specific life that mattered to the person living it. This is the franchise's deepest argument against the institutional logic that produced the Great War. Not the political argument, the human one. Each individual whose final moments are recorded in a holotape, or whose last actions are written in a terminal log, or whose last position is preserved in the shape of their remains, was a person with everything that personhood implies. The institutional logic that allowed the Great War to happen treated those lives as acceptable losses in service of goals larger than individual lives. The holotapes argue, without making the argument explicitly, that there are no acceptable losses, that every terminal log is someone's whole world, ended, and that the ending was not justified by whatever the institutional calculus said it was justified by. The franchise is not subtle about this, but it makes the argument through accumulation rather than through declaration through the sheer number of individual lives it lets you encounter in fragments, each one insisting on its own particularity, each one refusing to be reduced to a number in someone's cost-benefit analysis. You can't listen to Edward's holotape and think of him as a statistic. He was confused, he was scared. He was waiting for someone to tell him what to do. The franchise knows that. It's why the holotapes are there. Section 13. The surface was always the experiment. The Prime Video Fallout series contains a line in its second season that arrives not as a revelation but as a confirmation. Hank McClane, whose pre-war history as a Vault-Tec operative has been fully exposed by that point, speaks with the flat certainty of someone stating a geological fact. The surface is the experiment, not the vaults. The vaults were the control conditions. The controlled laboratory environments where Vault-Tec could manage the variables, monitor the outcomes, generate data about specific populations under specific engineered pressures. The vaults were where the experiment was designed and initiated. The surface was where the results played out. The survivors who came out of vaults with whatever the vault had done to them, whatever social structures it had shaped them by, whatever psychological adaptations their particular experimental conditions had produced, were released into an uncontrolled environment and observed across generations. The survivors who never entered vaults, who managed the surface on their own terms, brought their own adaptations. The factions that formed the NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel, Caesar's Legion, the Enclave, the Institute, the hundreds of smaller communities and cults and trading organizations across the wasteland are the emergent results of those conditions operating over time. They are the data. The NCR arose from the exile population of Vault 15, a diverse group whose specific mix produced a particular political culture that persisted and grew into a democracy spanning California and extending east into Nevada. The Brotherhood arose from a military unit that rejected institutional authority in a specific way at a specific moment, carrying their refusal forward as an institutional identity across 200 years. Caesar's Legion arose from one man's encounter with tribal culture and his decision to apply Roman historical models to wasteland reality. These are not random outcomes. They are the specific results of specific conditions operating on specific populations. They are the kind of results an experiment is designed to generate. Whether anyone is still watching is the theory's open question. The Enclave, before its defeat in Fallout 3, was actively monitoring the post-war surface, maintaining aerial assets, broadcasting infrastructure, an intelligence network that covered the capital wasteland and extended west. The Enclave was the institutional heir of the observation function, the pre-war government's remnant maintaining the data collection the societal preservation program had been designed to generate. With the Enclave's defeat, the organized observation infrastructure ended. But the data generation didn't stop. The factions keep competing. New settlements keep forming and failing and reforming. The behavioral outcomes the Vault experiments were designed to produce are still playing out, still generating results, whether or not any institutional observer exists to receive them. The version of this theory that doesn't require a surviving observer is about what the franchise is saying, across 25 years of games, about human nature through the aggregate of everything it has shown. The Wasteland keeps producing things that Vault-Tec's experimental design didn't account for. Every game gives you a protagonist who makes choices that exceed what the system predicted, who helps people the system would have categorized as acceptable losses, who forms genuine relationships with beings the system would have classified as experimental subjects, who finds, in the ruins of a civilization partially built to study how people behave when civilization collapses, something that the study was designed to measure but can never itself produce. The specific, irrational, unrepeatable decision to keep being human when nothing requires it, to help someone when it costs you, to build something when the odds favor destruction, to care about a person the way you'd care about yourself. The vaults were designed to contain and observe human behavior. The people in them, and on the surface around them, kept producing behavior that the containers didn't anticipate. The NCR became too complex and diverse to be simply characterized. The Brotherhood fragmented along lines the original founding ideology didn't predict. Individual characters across 6 games kept making the choice that surprised the system. The data kept exceeding the model. Maybe that's the experiment's actual result, the demonstration that human behavior cannot be fully contained by the systems designed to study it. That the thing the experiment was built to measure what people do under extreme conditions keeps producing outcomes that the experimental design couldn't account for, which means that the design's assumptions about human beings were wrong, in ways that are, in a very specific sense, encouraging. The vaults are still out there, some still running, some sealed, some failed in ways nobody planned for, their residents having escaped the experimental parameters and become something none of the designers anticipated. The surface is still the experiment, the results are still coming in, and every time someone builds something in the rubble, every time a community forms around a water source or a market, or the specific accident of proximity that turns strangers into neighbors, the results are defying the hypothesis that produced the experiment. The specific way that the surface as experiment theory changes your relationship to the franchise's protagonists is worth exploring at length, because it adds a dimension to every choice the games give you that the games themselves don't explicitly acknowledge. If the protagonists of the franchise are, on some level, subjects in an ongoing experiment, if the vault system and the surface conditions were designed to produce specific behavioral outcomes, and if the choices you make as the player are, within the fiction of the game, the choices of a person shaped by those conditions, then every decision in the games is simultaneously a free choice and a data point. Simultaneously an expression of individual agency and a result produced by the experimental conditions. This is an uncomfortable frame, because it potentially undermines the significance of the choices the games ask you to take seriously. If the courier's decision about who to support at Hoover Dam is the product of conditions engineered to produce behavioral data, is it really a choice? Does the choice still matter? The franchise's answer, and this is the answer that emerges from sitting with the whole arc of the lore, from the first game to the TV series, is yes. The choice still matters, and it matters specifically because the experimental design didn't account for it. The choices that matter in the Fallout franchise are not the ones that fall within the predictable range of the experimental design. They're the ones that exceed it. The Vault Dweller, choosing to help Shady Sands even after completing the Vault mission, extending care beyond the institutional requirement, into the human response that Vault Tech's models presumably accounted for, but didn't expect to produce lasting consequences, is a choice outside the design. The Lone Wanderer choosing to purify the water supply even at personal cost, after the entire Capital Wasteland's institutional framework has been organized around that water for 20 years, that's a choice the experiment might have predicted as statistically unlikely. The courier choosing to help the small communities of the Mojave before addressing the larger political conflict, that's a choice that reflects values the Vault experiment wasn't trying to measure. The franchise has been telling a consistent story across its entries about what human beings do that exceeds the experimental design imposed on them. Not always. Not consistently. Not as a rule, because the franchise is too honest about human failure to pretend the choice is always made correctly. But persistently enough, across enough different characters and enough different circumstances, to constitute an argument. The argument is this: that the thing Vault-Tec was trying to study, how human beings behave under conditions of total social control and extreme pressure, is not the thing that ultimately matters about human beings. What matters is what they do when the design fails to contain them. When the choice available isn't any of the design choices. When they find a way to be more than what the experiment allowed for. The overseer of Vault 11's final survivors did not sacrifice anyone. That was outside the design. The designers got data about what they did instead, and the data doesn't tell them what they wanted to know. It tells them something the design didn't account for. That's the surface experiment's most important result. Not the factions, not the social structures, not the data about obedience and compliance and failure modes. The result that matters is the persistent discovery that the subjects of the experiment keep exceeding the parameters of the experiment. The surface is the experiment. The experiment is still running. And the results keep coming in with data that the people who designed the experiment didn't know they were asking for. That might be the most hopeful thing in the franchise. Not the settlements, though the settlements are hopeful. Not the communities, though the communities are hopeful. The fact that what human beings do, over and over, in the worst conditions imaginable, is produce outcomes that the systems imposed on them didn't predict. The experiment is still running, the data is still coming in, and the data suggests that the hypothesis was wrong. People are not what the vaults thought they were. They are something more complicated, and more hopeful, and more surprising than that. 250 years of the wasteland has been generating evidence for exactly that conclusion. The theories are still out there, in the dark. The terminal logs are still glowing, and whoever is still watching is finding in the data something they didn't build the experiment to find. Something that exceeds the design. The franchise's relationship with hope is the thing that most distinguishes it from other post-apocalyptic fiction, and the surface as experiment theory clarifies why. Most post-apocalyptic fiction treats the apocalypse as the story's central trauma, the wound. Everything else is organized around healing from or failing to heal from. The narrative tension is between restoration and acceptance, whether the world can be made whole again or whether the characters have to find a way to live in a permanently broken one. The human beings in post-apocalyptic fiction are, generally, defined by their relationship to what was lost. Fallout doesn't do this. Its human beings are defined by what they're building, not what they lost. The NCR, flawed and sprawling and corrupt and overextended as it is an attempt to build something new. The settlements of the Commonwealth, fragile and isolated and vulnerable as they are attempts to build something new. The railroad's insistence that synthetic people deserve freedom is an attempt to build a moral framework that doesn't exist yet in the wasteland's political landscape, something new, built from principles rather than from pre-war blueprints. The pre-war world's blueprints are available. The franchise makes this explicit in Fallout 76's Appalachia, where the various factions are literally fighting over the question of which pre-war template the post-war world should be modeled on. The responders want the civil services that made pre-war civilization functional. The Free States want the libertarian frontier that the pre-war American frontier mythology promised. The Raiders want the freedom from all constraint that the pre-war world's institutions enforced against. Every faction is working from a pre-war blueprint, trying to apply it to post-war conditions, finding that the fit is imperfect in different ways. What the franchise's arc across its entries suggests not as a declared message, but as the implicit argument of the choices it keeps making about what gets rewarded and what doesn't, is that the post-war world's salvation, if it has one, won't come from the pre-war templates. It'll come from the things that exceed them, from the choices that weren't in the Vault experiment's design, from the connections and communities and moral commitments that people built without institutional support, in conditions specifically designed to prevent that building. The Institute designed synths as tools, and the synths became people. Vault-Tec designed vaults as experiments, and some of the Vault communities became something the experiment didn't plan for. The Master designed the super mutant army as a solution, and the solution contained a flaw the Master hadn't tested for. Every institutional design in the franchise meets, at some point, the thing it didn't design for the stubborn, persistent, statistically unlikely human tendency to do something the design said shouldn't happen. This is the hope the franchise is actually about. Not the hope that everything gets fixed. Not the hope that civilization gets restored, or that the radiation goes away, or that the institutions get better. The hope that human beings, given even the worst conditions, keep producing outcomes that exceed the worst predictions about them. The experiment is still running. The results keep coming in. And the results, across 250 years of wasteland history and across 6 games and a television series, keep showing the same thing. That what people do, when pushed past the edge of what any system designed for them expected them to do, is find ways to matter to each other. The bombs fell. The vaults closed. The experiments ran. And in the aftermath, people kept finding each other, kept building things, kept making choices that the design said were statistically unlikely. That's the Wasteland's real secret. Not the theories, though the theories are true. Not the horrors, though the horrors are real. The secret is that it's still full of people finding each other in the dark. And that, of all the things the franchise has shown you across however many hours you've spent in it, is the thing worth staying awake for. Even if you're falling asleep. Especially then. Closing. There's something about the Fallout universe that makes it particularly well-suited for this kind of long, unhurried exploration. The world is dense enough that you can spend hundreds of hours in it and still find corners of lore that surprise you, terminal entries that reframe something you thought you understood, holotapes that fill in a background detail that changes the foreground, environmental arrangements that only reveal what they're showing you when you stand in the right position and pay the right kind of attention. The horror of the Wasteland is patient. It doesn't jump. It waits in the terminal logs for whoever reads them slowly. It sits in the positions of bones in rooms nobody had a reason to enter. It lives in the audio of people who were losing something they couldn't name while they were recording it. Vault-Tec built an atrocity using the institutional language of a civic project. The bombs fell because of decisions made in conference rooms and executive suites by people who expressed those decisions in the language of fiduciary responsibility. The vaults were laboratories dressed as shelters. The experiment has been running for over 250 years. In the rubble and the irradiated landscape and the factions that keep forming and competing and falling and forming again. And in the quiet hours of the wasteland, between the ambient sounds and the low music and the particular silence that opens up when there's nothing immediately trying to kill you, the theories are still there, in the dark, waiting for whoever looks closely enough to find them. The terminal logs are glowing. The holotapes are sitting in their cases. The vaults are running. The surface is the experiment. And we're all walking through it. Thank you for spending this time here. If one of these theories is going to surface at 3 in the morning a week from now, drop it in the comments. I want to know which one. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. There's more waiting. Sleep well. The franchise has outlasted the cultural moment that produced it in a way that few games manage. It was born in 1997 in the specific anxiety of Cold War aftermath, the late 90s period where the immediate existential fear had receded, but the infrastructure of that fear was still present, the missile silos still there, the institutional framework still operating. The question of what nuclear civilization had done to the people living inside it, still unanswered. The retro-futurist aesthetic, the Jetsons' optimism of the 1950s, rendered in post-apocalyptic ruins, was a deliberate commentary on the gap between what American consumer culture had promised and what American geopolitical reality had delivered. That commentary aged into something broader than its original specific target. By the time of Fallout 3 in 2008, the franchise was speaking to a generation that had grown up in the aftermath of a different kind of institutional failure. The collapse of the assumption that American institutions were fundamentally trustworthy, the revelation that the official account of major events was not always the complete account, the growing understanding that the systems people lived inside didn't necessarily have their interests at heart. Fallout 3's Washington, D.C., rendered in ruins, with the monuments to American democratic aspiration standing intact in a world where American democracy had ended, hit differently in 2008 than the original game's California radiation had in 1997. New Vegas in 2010 was even more precisely calibrated to its moment, a game about competing institutional claims on the future of a post-collapse society, released during the period of maximum uncertainty about what American political institutions were going to do next. The NCR's democratic dysfunction and the Legion's authoritarian order and House's technocratic control and the Courier's individual agency were not accidental choices. They were a map of the ideological options that the early 2010s were actually presenting to the people playing the game. Fallout 4 in 2015 landed in the early years of what would become the algorithmic era, the period when the question of what is human and what is a very good simulation of human, which the Institute's synth program poses, was starting to become a question about real technology rather than speculative fiction. The franchise has a habit of asking the question that the cultural moment is asking through the frame of post-apocalyptic lore, and asking it just precisely enough that the answer isn't obvious. The TV series in 2024 extended this into a new medium and found, perhaps surprisingly, that the franchise's central concerns institutional betrayal, The question of what civilization owes the people inside it, the persistence of human connection in the worst possible conditions, translated without dilution. The surface as experiment reveal worked as television drama, because it worked as political argument. The people who built the vaults to save humanity were the people who ensured the bombs fell, and they did it for reasons that made sense within their institutional framework, which is the most terrifying thing about them. What the franchise has been doing, across 25 years and multiple creative teams and several different publishers, is returning to the same set of questions. Not because the questions are unanswerable, though they are, mostly, but because they're the right questions. The questions about what institutions owe individuals, about what knowledge obligates action, about whether civilization's benefits justify its costs, about where the line is between acceptable loss and unacceptable crime. These are the questions that the franchise keeps returning to, because they're the questions that the world keeps failing to answer. The bombs fell in Fallout because a world organized around those questions and answering them badly, across decades, produced the conditions for the bombs to fall. The bombs haven't fallen here, for whatever combination of luck and nuclear deterrence and institutional friction and individual human decency has kept them grounded for 70-something years since Hiroshima. But the franchise keeps asking whether we're answering the questions better than the pre-war world did, whether the institutional logic is different enough, whether the acceptable losses are being counted differently. The honest answer is, somewhat. Not enough. The franchise is not optimistic about institutions. It's optimistic about people. And the distinction matters. Institutions failed the pre-war world. People keep failing and recovering in the post-war one. That's not a small difference. It's the whole argument. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here when you wake up. It always is. And somewhere out there, in the dark between the theories and the ruins and the questions without answers, the mysterious stranger's theme is playing for someone who didn't know they needed it. If you made it this far, thank you. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's something I've been doing for a while now, and I never stop finding it strange and good that people from so many different places end up in the same dark corner of the internet, listening to the same stories about the end of the world. If this helped you sleep, or think, or just pass the time in the quiet hours, subscribe and come back. There are more worlds to walk through, more theories waiting in the terminals, more stories in the ruins. The wasteland never runs out of things to tell you, neither do I.